The Futile Facade. Chapter 10. December landed on wings of ice and roared with the breath of an irritable grizzly. The first Thursday afternoon after the second task found Rigel bundled to her ears, making a slow tunnel through the soft snow toward the forbidden forest. Tree Slider was curled against her chest, hissing a litany of doubtful words under 3 layers of clothing. The wind is smudged to shearing, speaker. The boomslang snake's voice came floating up to her ears, and Rigel tucked her chin in response. "This was your idea," she hissed into the neck of her jumper. "Your nest is so warm," Tree Slider said plaintively. "How was I to know this monstrous storm awaited us?" "I said it was cold," Rigel said, chuckling a little at the snake's dramatics. It had long since stopped snowing, and was now only blowing the fresh powder back and forth. Speaker is known to have a poor understanding of heat. Rigel thought Tree Slider had a poor understanding of words, but she didn't want to argue with the snake. Instead, she stopped moving toward the forest and said, "Does this mean you don't want to see how your nest is doing today?" Tree Slider shuddered against her torso. "It is lost under this mess. We must return to the stone forest before we freeze." "All right." She sighed. Would that the snake had made this determination before she'd slogged halfway across the grounds. A familiar voice called out from the swirling winds, an unfamiliar tone of urgent amusement in its pitch. "Save me." "Rigel, stop them." Hermione was tearing across the lawn, bright blue scarf trailing behind her like the tail of a kite. She rounded Rigel and ducked down behind her, as though Rigel's unimpressive girth was capable of shielding her from sight in this expanse of white. Only a dozen paces behind her, 2 bundles of burgundy were committed in a headlong charge. Rigel felt mischief curl within her. "When I say so, jump to the side," she murmured to the girl doubled over in breathless laughter behind her. She waited until the Weasley twins were near enough to see the whites in her eyes. Her arms outstretched, she said, "Guys, we can talk about this like reasonable, now." Rigel and Hermione leapt out of the way, and the twins, who'd each taken a running lunge to cover the last several feet, fell in an explosion of powder and spluttered outrage. Fred came up first, spewing, "Traitor," alongside a mouthful of snow. George shook himself like a dog, sending wet misery everywhere in a 3-foot radius. "And no fair," he said, taking his feet with some difficulty. Rigel schooled her face to blankness, refusing to give sympathy to the boys who would have cheerfully plowed her into the snow. "What are you doing, chasing Hermione?" Rigel asked them, folding her arms in a posture of mock sternness. "When I introduced you, I'm sure I mentioned she was under my protection." Fred scowled up at her from his seat in the snow. "You can't have all the good ones, pup." "I left you wrong, didn't I?" Fred pursed his lips. "Ron doesn't squeal like he used to." Hermione let out a helpless laugh. "Why is everything here so weird?" "It's Hogwarts," the twins chorused. The looks on their faces indicated the statement should be self-evident. "You get used to it," Rigel offered. After a moment's thought, she frowned. "Actually, you never should. Harry won't forgive me if I send you back weird." "Harry is even weirder," Hermione muttered. "From her point of view, that may very well be the case," Rigel allowed. She turned back to George, who was now helping Fred brush the powder from his pants. "Why chase Hermione when there are so many more deserving souls in this world?" George smiled, and it was so innocent she automatically suspected a lie. "We just wanted to invite her to the Burrow this summer." Rigel allowed that to sink in for a moment before asking, "In what language is pursuit equivalent to an invitation?" Fred's expression was pitying as he drawled, "If you don't know the answer to that by now, pup, you may never figure it out." Before she could retort, George punched his brother lightly in the arm and said, "No. Bad, Forge, corrupting the puppy. Did they not see you face down a dragon?" Hermione's tone was altogether bewildered. "Fred and George have known me too long to be in awe," Rigel said. She found she was grateful for the thread of truth woven behind the humor as she spoke. "I can say the same, though. They try to pretend they don't care about anything except fun and chaos, but these two once braced a first-year's fractured wrist when he was too scared to go to the Medowitch." "Oh, puppy." Fred fell into her arms, and subsequently windmilled backwards just as quickly, once Tree Slider made himself heard from the confines of her shirt. "Why is your shirt speaking in Parcel tongue?" She brushed a soothing hand over the front of her jumper, murmuring comforting nothings to her familiar until he stopped threatening to eat the clumsy sack of flesh that had disturbed his slumber. "Is that the snake from the first task?" George asked, leaning close and peering in the general direction of her torso as though he could see through the layers to the irritable boomslang snake within. She resisted the urge to shy backwards from his gaze, knowing intellectually that there was nothing but a lumpy jumper to see. "His name is Tree Slider," she said. "After the difficulties in the forest, he's been somewhat resistant to rehabilitation." Not that she minded, really. Rigel felt rather selfish, but part of her wanted to keep the snake. He was a wild creature, not some pet. Still, each time he declined to go back to the forest, her heart warmed a little more toward the idea of enjoying his companionship indefinitely. "He was very brave for you," Hermione said, frowning thoughtfully. "Did you know him before the task, or did you use your gift to find him when you learned the task was in the forest?" "I met him my first year here," she admitted. "He's been a better friend than I probably deserve." "Friendship isn't about deserving anything," George said firmly. "It just is." Rigel smiled, but she knew it was one. "Easy for some to say," she supposed. "As long as we're on the spirit of friendship," Fred declared, looking between Hermione and Rigel with a deviously innocuous expression. "We really did want to invite you over to the Burrow this summer. Both of you, actually. Bring Harriet too, Rigel. It'll be fun." She could honestly say she'd never spent a day at the Burrow that wasn't fun. Hectic, farcical, and exhausting, yes, but unmistakably fun. "They keep telling me this mythical burrow is somehow held together with magic alone," Hermione said, openly dubious. "It isn't possible, though, to build something out of magic like that." Her eyes darted to Rigel's and she added, almost against her better judgment, "Is it?" Rigel considered her answer carefully. Hermione was, she had noticed, painstakingly correct in all things. "It has to be done slowly, over time, but yes, eventually it is possible for magic to compensate or even take the place of regular materials. It just depends on how much magic is regularly imbued into the foundational wards. Hogwarts is a great example of that, actually." Hermione looked vaguely disturbed. "Are you saying the castle is only held up by magic at this point?" She didn't seem comforted by the idea. "No, don't listen to Pup," Fred exclaimed. "He doesn't live in a centuries-old house stitched together with magic and love." "But, you do," Hermione clarified. "Sure," George said cheerfully. "And we can tell you all about it." "You can." Rigel grimaced as Hermione took the bait like a starving guppy. "It's a trap," she thought at the poor girl. "Don't do it." Alas, Hermione was no Legilimens. "Boy, can we?" George looped one of his arms through Hermione's, and it was the beginning of the end for the girl. The Burrow's primary wards date back several centuries. As you probably know, when subsequent wards are added within an existing set, the two works can be fused to become a single ward. This is the principle behind the Burrow's magnificence. Fred appropriated Hermione's free limb, picking up the narrative seamlessly. "Indeed, milady, and the more wards you add to the original as the years pass, the stronger the original ward becomes. Anyone trying to take down the Weasley wards now would have to not only break the power of the original Weasley who cast them, but also overcome the magic of every additional ward that's been cast there since." "But what if the wards are contradictory in nature?" Hermione was gone before Rigel could send a prayer to Merlin for her sanity. She returned to the castle at her own speed. A part of her enjoyed the bracing bite of the winter wind against her face. It felt real, in a way that the surrealism of the tournament and all the drama orbiting in its sphere never did. Sometimes it was hard to remember what she'd entered this absurd competition for. Just as sometimes it was hard to remember how deeply she was entrenched in the ruse. She tried not to think about it, mostly. It would only overwhelm her to consider the true implications of the wide, furrowed web she and Archie had managed to weave. -0. HP. -0. Rigel found her plate positively buried beneath packages Friday morning. A heavy parcel from Flourish and Blots contained several books on rituals that she'd catalog ordered after running through most of Hogwarts' unrestricted references on the subject. Lily's use of a ritual to imbue the obsidian necklace had refocused her interest in the subject, and she was certain there was a connection between Dumbledore's story about a witch who transferred her magic to another and the bottle of Riddle's magic slowly accumulating in her mindscape. She set the books aside and took the letter from the next package curiously. It was from Archie, and he advised her not to open it at the table. She heard the rattle of potions vials as she tucked the small rectangle into her book bag and smiled. It seemed her cousin had sent the additional samples of blood she'd asked for. Rigel already had enough for one unexpected blood identity test, but after the barrier she'd encountered in the second task, she wanted enough for each of the remaining tasks, too. The last parcel was soft, and contained both a letter and a number of pages from a Muggle newspaper that were yellowed with age. Rigel couldn't help but smile in anticipation as she perused the politely worded reply to an inquiry she'd sent to the Little Hangleton Public Records Office. Hermione had helped her find the correct address, and after that it was a simple matter of dropping it into the Muggle mail slot at the Hogsmeade Owlery. Dear Mr. Riddle, your research has led you to right place, but I regret to inform you that the search for your estranged family is not yet at an end. The Riddle family did indeed have a prominent branch seated in our town for a number of generations, and in fact owned much of the town itself at one point. In 1943, however, Squire Riddle sold the family holdings to the town council and moved his entire family with very little warning. Unfortunately, Thomas Riddle did not provide any forwarding address. We have heard no news of the family since they left Little Hangleton. In order to facilitate your search, I have included every mention of the Riddle family I could find in our town archives. If you do discover where the subsequent generations of the Riddle family ended up, I hope you'll write again and let me know. It would be a satisfactory conclusion to a mystery that has interested the townsfolk for many years. Best of luck in your endeavor. Sincerely, Agatha Spool. Little Hangleton Archives. Rigel's grin was threatening to spill over her face as she set the letter aside and thumbed through the Muggle newspaper clippings. She had no interest in the many articles about Squire Riddle's shady business dealings or Mary Riddle's social proclivities. As she flipped past an article about the acquisition of a large tract of land that had been originally set aside as a primary school, she found it, an edition from 1926 with the brazen headline "Squire's son elopes with local tramp," splashed across the front page. It was exactly the sort of gleefully salacious article one might expect from a small town with no love for its richest constituents. The text contained more speculation than fact, but one thing appeared to be indisputable: Tom Riddle, handsome son of Squire Thomas Riddle, had absconded suddenly and most perplexingly to London with one Mayrup Gaunt, daughter of local vagabond Marvolo Gaunt. The picture painted of Mayrup was not pleasant, and it was clear to Rigel that the townspeople suspected there was much more to the story. Dashing and wealthy young men did not often take up with the backwater, squalor-bred women of the world without the impetus of blackmail, villainy, or both. It's indisputable, she thought. The feeling of triumph that rushed through her was almost giddy. Tom Riddle is a half-blood. Given the Riddle family's sudden relocation, she reckoned he'd tried to cover his heritage up by sending the Riddle family somewhere far away, but he couldn't obviate every townsperson in Little Hangleton. Her next thought cut through the giddiness with wariness. How in Merlin's name could no one else know? It had taken her less than a month of serious searching to put the pieces together. Was it really possible that no one else had ever wondered? Maybe he's silencing them, a grim voice offered. Or disappearing them, like he did his whole Muggle family. With that ominous possibility ringing in her mind, she rolled up the newspapers and tucked them into her bag with the letter. As she straightened, she met Pansy's eyes, and the blonde girl leaned in from her seat beside her to ask, "What have you done, Rigel?" The girl had probably caught the name Riddle on every newspaper article as Rigel flipped through them. Still, Rigel tilted her head carefully and asked, "Are you certain you want to know?" Pansy stared hard at her for a long moment, but in the end, she shook her head and turned her worried eyes back to her own breakfast. "Be careful," was all she said. Rigel smiled reassuringly, but inside she was torn. On the one hand, Riddle was a dangerous man, and he probably wouldn't hesitate to retaliate if he knew what she was up to. On the other hand, she thought too many people had been careful around him for too long. If those around him had been a little less careful and a little more suspicious, he might never have built the powerful mystique that let him waltz through the world without any regard for it. There was, she supposed, at least one person she could speak to freely about it. All that morning in her healing class she was semi-attentive at best, and she barely managed to choke down a few bites of food at lunch in her excitement. It was only after impatiently giving the gargoyle the password and hurrying up the spiraling stairs that she realized Dumbledore was still down in the Great Hall and she would have to wait for him to finish his meal before she could share her grand theory. The wind in her sails sufficiently snuffed, Rigel sank into one of the soft, oversized chairs that littered the headmaster's office and took out one of her new books to pass the time. It was titled Rituals of Transference and the table of contents told her it was broken into sections pertaining to familial and non-familial magical transfer. She settled in to read, on the lookout for any use of transference magic that sounded potentially malicious. The subject matter turned out to be too interesting to skim, however, and she found herself nose-deep in a chapter about bloodline transference when Fawkes trilled out a welcome. Rigel glanced up to see Dumbledore twinkling genially down at her. "Are my clocks running slow today?" he asked curiously. She flushed. "No, sir. I'm running early. There was something I wanted to ask you about before we began today's alchemy lesson." "Ah. In that case, why don't we address your question in comfort before adjourning to the workroom?" He rearranged a chair so that it was facing hers with a whimsical flick of his fingers and called for tea and biscuits. The soft, gooey sweets wafted chocolate fumes her direction and Rigel, who hadn't eaten as much as she should have at lunch, accepted one with chagrined gratitude. "Now, to this lunch-averting matter," the headmaster said with a wink. "What can I help you with today, Mr. Black?" Rigel opened her mouth, and suddenly realized she had no idea where to start or how to explain her recent obsession with riddles genealogy. After a moment's hesitation, she pulled the bundle of newspaper clippings from her bag and selected the relevant one for Dumbledore's perusal. "I've been looking into Riddle's background," she said, grimacing. "I know it's a bit gauche, but I'm so tired of my friends calling him Lord Riddle and acting as though he's the next coming of Sir Laser Slytherin." Dumbledore's eyebrows rose as he rapidly scanned the paper's contents, but when he leveled his piercingly blue gaze at her, he showed no real surprise. "So you have discovered Tom's somewhat ignoble roots. I'm certain you're aware that he would prefer this knowledge never see the light of modern day." "You knew?" Rigel frowned. "Sir, forgive me, but I don't understand why no one else does. This undermines everything he's been trying to do for the last 50 years. If it was leaked, it could change everything." As Dumbledore continued to look impassively grave, she added, "Couldn't it?" Dumbledore sighed. "I am aware of Tom's heritage, in part because I was the professor sent to introduce him to the wizarding world. While at Will's orphanage, I spoke with the proprietress about the circumstances of young Tom's arrival there. His mother only lived long enough to name him for his father and grandfather, but this information was sufficient to trace his origins the very same way you have now done." "Why isn't it commonly known?" Rigel asked, still confused. "I mean, wouldn't people have asked while he was in school?" "Tom himself was unaware of his lineage until very late in his school years, I believe," Dumbledore said slowly. "He was thought to be a Muggle-born, at first, but when rumors of his Parseltongue ability began to circulate the school, that belief changed. After all, who ever heard of a Parselmouth who wasn't a pure-blood?" The question, eerily reminiscent of something Draco had said, sent a thrum of unease through Rigel. Sometimes, it seemed Dumbledore's gaze was too perceptive. If she didn't have faith in Dom's ability to warn her of even the subtlest attempt at legilimency, she might worry for her secrets. Rigel considered the old man's words, but had to ask, "If you knew, why haven't you said anything?" This could drastically affect his support base. Dumbledore regarded her almost pityingly. "Tom will only deny it. All evidence aside, he will claim the Riddle name comes from the mystery of his origins, and that the Muggles you traced until their disappearance were a mere coincidence. But if the speculation is made, he'd have to give some explanation, wouldn't he?" she asked. Even though part of her balked at essentially treating the half-blood label as an accusation, she knew that his supports would see it that way. "Why not use it, then? His mother is certainly Mayrup Gaunt. The Parseltongue gift, as well as the orphanage's records, would be proof of that. He'd have to give some account of his father. Who else could he claim? I believe he would probably name Morfin Gaunt, if pressed," the headmaster said quietly. Rigel gaped at him. His uncle. Incest is more palatable than the truth, to those who would care in the first place, Dumbledore reminded her gently. She grimaced in distaste. But even still, Morfin was in prison for 3 years. She shook her head. It just isn't possible. Riddle's birth date is listed as a year and a half after his uncle's imprisonment. Unless you're suggesting Mayrup went to Azkaban for conjugal visits with her brother. She attempted to say it sarcastically, but as the words came out of her mouth she realized with horror that it was exactly what some might suggest. There are those for whom even that explanation would be preferable. Dumbledore didn't seem disgusted or disappointed by that fact, merely resigned. Rigel let out a huff of revulsion. That's just, what is wrong with the world? No matter which way she looked at it, Dumbledore was absolutely right. If she came forward with the information, not only would she paint a giant target on her back, but Riddle wouldn't even flinch. He'd probably play the embarrassed pureblood card and cagily admit that his parents had been siblings in unsanctioned lust. Better than that, allow the whisper of a possibility that he, Lord Riddle, head of the SOW party and preeminent bigot in all of Britain, could be a half-blood. All her research, for nothing. She bit through the biscuit in her hand with an annoyed growl. After chewing it over both literally and figuratively for a moment, she said, I don't suppose we could force him to do a blood test. She didn't need Dumbledore's regretful look to tell her it was impossible. Riddle was simply too powerful to make him do anything he didn't want to do. Back to square one, then. Unless, she shot the headmaster a considering look. Maybe we could trick him, somehow. Is there any magic that only a pureblood can perform? Dumbledore frowned thoughtfully. Apart from very specific inheritance magic, I'm not aware of anything. That is, of course, what makes the distinction largely superfluous in the first place. Rigel flushed. Yes, sir. Really, what had she been expecting? If there was an easy way to undermine Riddle, no doubt the headmaster would have done it long ago. She glanced down at the book in her lap thoughtfully. When you say inheritance magic, do you mean familial rituals? I'm reading about them now. There are a few that sound incredibly powerful, but it strikes me that I don't know any purebloods who would actually want to use one. How you do mean? The headmaster asked, a mild frown on his face. Well, a lot of the inheritance-type rituals in this book seem to require significant sacrifice on one side. For instance, this line circumvention ritual, she turned to the page and tilted the book so that Dumbledore could see the description, was designed around the transfer of familial gifts to an unrelated, lesser-blooded witch or wizard. The idea was that the last heir to a family could pass his or her gifts to a half-blood or muggle-born. This way, rather than allow the magic of an old line to go extinct or fade into obscurity as it blends into other strong pure-blooded lines, the magic lives on even when the family dies out. I can't say I've ever heard of such a ritual being performed, Dumbledore said, his slow, elderly voice contrasting sharply with the speed at which his eyes roamed over the page. Rigel nodded. Exactly. Because what pureblood in existence would be both utterly selfless and utterly unprejudiced to the extent that they would sacrifice their own gift in order that another, less pure wizard might wield it instead. All who come immediately to mind are also those for whom the passing on of family magic would not be a strong priority. As he said it, she wondered if he was thinking about Sirius. Even if her uncle had a family gift to pass on, he would never consider that it might be his duty to do so. Really, there was something tragically ironic about it all. Purebloods liked to think of themselves as so very unique, but the type of magic that was truly exclusive to them was also that which would require them to give up that part of themselves in order to make use of it. She shook her head ruefully as she put the book away. I suppose you've listened to me rail against the system enough for one day, Professor. Shall we, as you put it, adjourn to the workroom? The system might be better tempered if it had more occasion to resist a good railing, Dumbledore said with a chuckle. Nevertheless, your father is paying good tuition for me to educate you, rather than the other way around. A wise man once said, education is a journey, not a destination, and as such may not be rushed, Rigel said, standing along with the aged professor. Which wise man was that? Uncle Remus, she admitted, grinning briefly. It was a shame he couldn't keep teaching here. Something should really be done about that curse. Dumbledore inclined his head regretfully. The only two curse breakers to try their wands at lifting it were both irreversibly altered by the attempt. Since then, I have ceased commissioning the work, though I admit it is especially difficult to bear when it means bidding farewell to so dedicated an educator as Mr. Lupin. They crossed to the bookcase where Dumbledore pulled the secret lever to reveal his workspace. It never ceased to amuse Rigel that a wizard who was taken so seriously by so many had an irrepressibly whimsical streak. "Tell me, has your uncle found alternative work to satisfy him?" She nodded slowly, recalling the last couple of letters from Remus. "I think so. He's begun tutoring a group of orphan kids who live in London. Not as structured an environment as Hogwarts, of course, but I think he enjoys the challenge and the chance to pass on what he knows to those who didn't receive the same opportunities he did." Dumbledore smiled, but there was something incredibly sad about it. Many are the risks that turned to regret over the years, and few the gambles brought to vindication. When I balance the scales of my life, however, I do believe the decision to admit Remus Lupin to Hogwarts will be one of the heaviest achievements in the basket of absolute good. His words brought a lump to Rigel's throat, and she was abruptly reminded of her purpose in coming to Hogwarts in the first place. It hadn't been to challenge the system or prove herself to anyone. She had only come to learn, and sometime this year she had begun to lose sight of that ambition, a guiding star lost in a meteor shower. In the midst of everything raining down around her, she had to wonder if she would ever get back to that girl. And when all of it came to an end, in which basket would her decision to become Rigel Black fall? -0. HP. -0. Rigel walked into Lab 3 the next morning ready to demand that Snape honor his bargain to teach her free brewing in exchange for her making it through the second task and mastering projected magical awareness. She wore the unshakable determination like a cloak. This time, no matter how dangerous he claimed the next task would be, she would not be put off with more ancillary lessons. This time, they would brew. Snape was already within, and as he turned to greet her, she cut him off sternly. "We are free brewing today or I will transfer to Durmstrang and take up an apprenticeship with Master Montmorency," she declared. The dark-haired man drew his spine in, increasing his already imposing height, and raised an unimpressed eyebrow at her. "Master Montmorency will never take an apprentice who can't even use his own eyes before speaking." Rigel blinked. She leaned around her head of house to see a cauldron sitting innocently at its brewing station and an array of ingredients laid out on the large countertop. "Oh." She felt the blood move into her cheeks and her chin drop an inch as her indignation lost its direction abruptly. "Good," she managed. Snape watched with open amusement as she pulled on her protective apron, gloves, and glasses. Rigel couldn't begrudge him his humor at her expense, not when the warm glow of anticipation was climbing its way out from the deepest corners of her heart. She took up the brewer's position beside the workstation and gave the potions master her undivided attention. "How do we begin?" "There are differing philosophies when it comes to free brewing," he told her. "The discipline is by its very nature non-standard. Some begin with a known recipe and attempt to alter it." He paused, as though gauging her reaction to the idea. Rigel pursed her lips. That didn't sound like true free brewing. Snape's mouth curled into the semblance of a smile and approval slipped into his voice. "It is my opinion that such an approach only limits the imagination and stifles the entire process. It may be safer, but reward is always proportional to risk." Rigel quite agreed. She didn't want to incrementally alter existing recipes until she reached an arbitrary threshold of different enough. The point of free brewing was to create something entirely new. "How did you learn?" she asked. "Trial and error," Snape said. He grimaced in remembrance. "It was a frustrating and dangerous path, one I would not lead another down." Rigel frowned. The more she gleaned about his apprenticeship with Master Lu, the more she thought that not all brilliance lent itself to instruction. She was exceedingly fortunate that Professor Snape had both knowledge and the patience to impart it. Her head of house gestured to the ingredients before her. "Instead, I have devised an introduction to this art that is both open-ended enough to foster free thinking and limited enough to focus your efforts." "What do most of these ingredients have in common?" Rigel surveyed the counter slowly. Whether powdered, dried, or fresh, there were very few ingredients she couldn't recognize on sight. "All of them have effects on the mind," she said after a moment. Snape inclined his head sharply. You must come to free brewing without a preconceived idea of how your potion will be constructed. Equally true, you must never put things into the cauldron without a purpose. The key, then, is to begin with a strict idea of what you want the potion to accomplish, and work backwards to the how. She nodded slowly. It made a kind of sense, but she suspected she'd understand what he meant better when she actually did it. For now, I will set you goals and provide a semi-limited array of ingredients you may use, Snape said. He folded his arms across his chest and fixed her with a challenging look. Your first potion must lessen a person's grief without also suppressing positive emotions. Rigel's head tilted to one side as she thought. Interesting. Not just a blanket emotional suppressant, then. She waited to see if he would give her any other instructions, but her professor merely stared at her expectantly. With a slow grin, she snapped her magical awareness about her like a permeable shield and reached for the oils. Her hand hesitated for a moment over peppermint, but with a shake of her head she took the lavender oil instead and coated the cauldron. As she set the fire to a mild temperature, Rigel ran through the various subtasks inherent in Snape's challenge. The brain was a complex series of balances, and she thanked her healing training for giving her the vocabulary to express what she wanted to accomplish at the most basic level. More than anything, bad feelings flourished in the absence of good feelings. Foremost, then, she needed ingredients to increase norepinephrine for positive drive, serotonin for happiness, and dopamine for pleasure. Then something to cloud the sharp memories. When the bottom oil was warm, she filled the cauldron halfway with plain water and turned up the heat until it simmered. Moving back to the counter, Rigel collected the petals and stigmas of a crocus sativus plant first. The longer they steeped, the stronger the antidepressant effect would be. Next came root of curcuma, sliced thin into rounds so unsettlingly orange she thought it must have been grown in a magical greenhouse. Chia seeds, ginseng, and powdered cocoa followed. She tipped a vial of raw honey into the pot and watched as it grew thin and dispersed as Rigel coaxed the fire higher. Her sensitivity whispered along the edges of her concentration as she stirred clockwise, not counting so much as watching, waiting. Rigel resisted the urge to consciously imbue, reminding herself that as long as she was projecting her magical awareness, she probably didn't need to. She eyed the St. John's wort, but in the end thought better of it. The powerful antidepressant was also unpredictably reactive. Without knowing exactly what it would do to the serotonin levels, it wasn't worth the risk. When the powder of the cocoa had completely dissolved, she removed the stirring rod and reached for two shining strands of hair. The first was velar, and the second from the tail of a unicorn. She twisted the two hairs together and wound them around the stirring utensil before submersing it in the hot liquid. Rigel held it there, watching silver bleed slowly into the mixture, and when she felt the magic stop seeping into the potion, she removed the hairs, now blanched, and set them aside. After a scoop of crushed fee fruit to dull recollections, she sealed the bulk of the mixture with a layer of sunflower oil and sprinkled a handful of dried pixie wings across the top. Rigel thought the oil might allow the calmative magic of the pixie to seep into the potion without risking a reaction with the fairy fruit. She was wrong. Her potion tried to explode, because, just as the reaction began, Rigel flooded the cauldron with magic. The reaction froze before it could go any further, stalling into a kind of half-putrefied state, and Rigel thanked Snape's stubborn insistence on her perfecting her magical awareness that she got to keep her eyebrows. Rigel let out a slow breath and stepped back from the cauldron with a sigh. She glanced over at her professor and surprised a look of utter astonishment on his normally impassive face. "What is it?" she asked, a frown sliding onto her face. "Was I supposed to wait for it to explode?" He shook his head slowly and pulled a vial of thick, black sludge from his belt. She recognized the inertifying mixture as he poured it over her ruined cauldron and grimaced in rueful realization that he'd never expected her to create a viable potion on the first try. "Well done," Snape said, fixing her with a stare that was once again unfathomable. "Now, tell me what you did wrong." "The sunflower oil wasn't strong enough to keep the fairy and pixie magic from reacting negatively," Rigel said at once. After a moment's thought, she added, "Maybe an entire layer of honey would have served better." The potion's master made a noise of agreement. "Why did you add the pixie wings at all?" The potion as it stood prior to the addition of sunflower oil would in all likelihood have at least approached the goal. Rigel shrugged. "I wanted something that would suppress the amygdala." That's where anger and fear reside, and I think those can be a part of grief, too. Interesting hypothesis, Snape said. You'll write half a roll on that theory for next week. She nodded, and tested the heat of the cauldron with her hand beside it. Deeming it safe to touch, she carried it to the sink. That was fun, she said, looking over her shoulder. Rigel had expected free brewing to be exhilarating, and perhaps intellectually satisfying, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer, untainted pleasure that came with creating something completely from scratch, with no recipe or rules to tell her what she should or shouldn't do within the cauldron. Is it always fun? When it isn't terrifying, Snape said drolly. She laughed. It was impossible to imagine the serious professor being afraid of anything, so she supposed he only meant to tease her about the near disaster that was her first attempt at the art. Never mind failure, she thought. She would try again. Now that she knew what it felt like, bringing a brew to life with nothing but the impulses of her own mind, Rigel didn't know how she could go back to relying solely on recipes. It would be like asking a bird to walk, after it had already learned to fly. Well, she thought wryly, not fly, exactly. Glide, maybe. Rigel helped her professor consolidate the ingredients into crates to take back over to Lab 1, and she thought nothing could ruin her good mood. Then Snape said, "Has Lord Riddle discussed his intention to prepare you for the third task himself?" She growled audibly before she could stop herself. "I've no intention of humoring his attempts at mentorship. In case he doesn't get the picture, tell him kindly that I have a mentor, one who didn't shove his magic under my skin like some kind of human mosquito." Snape winced minutely, perhaps in response to her analogy, but more probably at the reminder of what Riddle had done to her with the help of his own machinations the year before. "Have you made progress in isolating the injection?" Rigel scowled at him from under her lashes, not sure how much she really ought to tell him. He was as beholden to Riddle as ever, after all. "I've been looking into it. Given enough time, I think I can separate it from my own magic, but I still don't know what it was intended to do." "Do you know," she added, daring him with her level gaze to lie to her. His expression was grave. "I have only suspicions. Lord Riddle never forgot that day you eavesdropped on our conversation in the Malfoy Gardens. He does not have the subtlety required of the mental arts to recognize mental shields at a distance, as I do. It is my suspicion, therefore, that at least part of his intention was to mark you in a way that only he would recognize." "It's not supposed to work like that," she said, frowning. "I've been reading about ritual transfer of magic, and the party who relinquishes a piece of his magic always loses touch with it as a consequence." There was no ritual that day, he reminded her. No runes, no sacrifice. When you imbue magic into a potion, do you lose the ability to sense it? Her eyes widened. "No," she whispered. Then she shook her head. "But I can only sense the resonance when he touches me." "It isn't your magic," Snape said. "What you perceive may not be a reflection of its limitations." Her hands shook on a container of saffron and she stilled them with a desperate will. It was a terrifying thought, that she'd been wrong about how the magic he'd mixed with hers might be utilized. A fool she was to think Riddle would forget that her lack of aura allowed her to successfully eavesdrop on his private conversations more than once. She'd been so sure that he couldn't possibly track her with the bit of his magic swimming in her veins, but maybe it was all just wishful thinking. Her head of house caught her eye and said, with the air of someone stating the obvious, "If you refrain from attempting to hide from his immediate perception, it may not cause you additional difficulties." It probably seemed simple to him. Snape had no idea as to her real concern. She'd thought avoiding any physical contact with Riddle would be tricky. This was much worse. How was she ever to be Harry Potter again, if Riddle could identify her as Rigel Black just by being in the same room? How was Archie to ever pretend to be Rigel in his presence? They couldn't until Riddle's magic was isolated and purged. A nuance in Snape's phrasing caught up to her and she looked sharply at his carefully blank expression. "What do you mean may not? You think there is something else it could do?" "If I am not wildly mistaken, Lord Riddle's primary motive in offering his tutelage in the first place was to convince you to use your magic in ways he deems beneficial," Snape said. His voice was so even as to be almost inflectionless, but she caught the hint of disapproval in the way he said tutelage. He didn't think much of Riddle's teaching abilities either, then. Rigel nodded easily. It had been obvious that Riddle wanted her to make the most of her powerful magic. He wanted me to stop suppressing it. And he got what he wanted, Snape reminded her. That was due to circumstances beyond anyone's control, Rigel said quickly. Don't underestimate his hand in seemingly unrelated events. Snape looked down at her with a frown. Did your magic not become more aggressive, harder to suppress, and more prone to defying your express will in the immediate aftermath of Lord Riddle's visitation? Rigel blanched at the implication. Could that really have been his aim? To force her to deal with her magic by making it even more unruly than it had been. She began to shake her head slowly, wanting to deny Riddle any hand in what had occurred in the Forbidden Forest the previous spring. At her pained disbelief, her head of house made an impatient noise. Think, boy. The most obvious piece of evidence is one simple fact: Lord Riddle wanted you to confront your magic, and you did. A dark scowl crept over her face. Sure I did. Only after it killed Pettigrew, though. A hollow laugh escaped her. If Riddle did have a hand in it, I guess the joke's on him. Snape's hand came down on her shoulder and she snapped her eyes up to meet his storm-filled gaze. You said the Dominion Jewel killed Pettigrew. Rigel dropped her gaze first. Both are true. The jewel mummified him, but I suspect my magic was well on its way to crushing him by the time that happened. The words came out utterly detached, and all she felt was a distant resignation, a pity for circumstances that were no longer hers to alter. Her head of house growled. Even if that's true, your magic was beyond your control at that moment. Maybe it was, or maybe it was acting on some subconscious desire I was afraid to acknowledge. She swallowed the bile that tried to rise at that admission. Steeling her stomach, she went on. Even if I try to lay that at Riddle's feet, even if I believe his magic inflamed the wild, indomitable aspects of my magic to the extent that it acted more aggressively than it otherwise would have, that still leaves me with a handful of Riddle's magic and no idea what to do with it. She shuddered. I hate that there's a piece of him in me. It makes my skin crawl. I understand, Snape said slowly. However, I do not believe that some minuscule amount of him could make you any more or less than you already were. Any claim you perceive his magic has placed on you is symbolic. He cannot own you unless you let him. Rigel's smile was brittle. He owns me this year. She looked up at her professor with a determined expression. It'll be worth it, though, if it crushes his awful legislation. If I win, things will be better for non-purebloods in Britain. She had to believe that. -0. HP. -0. Rigel found fire in her heart as she prepared to face the final preliminary task. Dueling was an arena she felt fairly comfortable in, but she knew that very sense of security might be her downfall. Too many people knew Harry Potter's style of dueling. Even without Remus attending the third task, the chance that those who knew her in the alleys might catch the mirrored dissemination of the event was high. Rigel could not use any of Harry's tricks to succeed in the upcoming duels. Her only recourse was to prioritize speed above finesse, and hope to outclass her opponents in sheer efficiency alone. The room of requirement obliged her needs, providing half a dozen panes of spell-reflecting glass that would throw anything she cast at them back in her face. Rigel trained with all of them, sometimes concentrating a flurry of spells on a single, shimmering pane, other times changing her target between every spell to test her footwork. There were limits to the training. She could only practice countering spells she herself knew how to cast, so it would do nothing for the sort of tailored defense Dawlish was attempting to drill into their heads. Still, it was better than casting at a dummy that couldn't hit back. By her third such session in the come-and-go room, Rigel had ceased attempting to block any of the spells she cast. Instead, she moved the reflecting glass closer and closer, forcing her mind and muscles to react faster in order to avoid getting hit. There was something also dance-like about the exercise, and as her mind became clearer and her body lunged and twisted with increasing fluidity, she thought she finally understood what Remus had been trying to push her instincts toward all this time. Such was the trance-like state her exercise inspired. Rigel didn't hear the door to the room opening behind her. She didn't notice the footsteps that approached the circle of mirrors in which she spun, and she didn't realize she was no longer alone until Draco's voice called out, "What on earth are you doing, Rigel?" She whirled to face him, and the spell she'd already cast sucker punched her in the shoulder. Rigel hissed at the sharp stinging hex and rubbed her hand over the flesh with a huff of annoyance. Draco, she said after the pain faded. What are you doing here? There's the today, he said, stepping between a gap in the suspended panes of glass and examining them curiously. I came early to set up. Do these reflect anything you shoot at them? As long as it isn't more powerful than the magic that went into creating them, Rigel said absently. She felt an incomprehensible desire to wipe the sweat from her neck and brush back her hair, but she ignored it. The last thing she would ever do was primp for Draco Malfoy. A part of her wanted to collect her bag and just leave the room, but she was braver than that. Draco turned away from the glass and silence stretched between them. Rigel didn't know what to say, and her friend's expression seemed suspended in some sort of cross between reluctance and regret. When she couldn't stand it anymore, she said, "This is ridiculous." At the very same moment, Draco blurted, "I didn't mean to." She stared at him. Blinked. Finally cleared her throat and asked, "Didn't mean to what?" She was pretty sure he had meant to kiss her. Unless someone had imperioused him. That would be a pretty pathetic use for an unforgivable curse, though. Draco blew out a frustrated breath. "I didn't mean to make it weird between us. This is why I never, before." Her eyebrows rose against her will. He made it seem as though it hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment impulse. "Has this been malingering?" she asked, almost afraid to know the answer. He laughed, a short, hoarse sound that cut off as abruptly as it had begun. "It's not an illness," he said, shaking his head. "Rigel, I've been interested for a while, all right. That night, I'd been thinking about you all day, since you reacted so strongly to my teasing." She winced, having already guessed that something about her embarrassment had triggered some underlying curiosity on his part. "Draco wasn't finished yet, though. I was half asleep, and getting all this feedback from my empathy, and I let myself get carried away. I'm sorry, okay? I wish I hadn't done it, with how it's changed everything." Rigel sighed. Draco was dramatic, but she couldn't deny that things had changed, somehow. The kiss was like a wrong number in an alchemical equation. A small mistake that had cascading effects. His expression beseeched her for forgiveness, and Rigel couldn't refuse her friend such a small thing. "I'm not upset, you know. I don't like you taking my emotions for permission, but I understand how you might feel, misled by your ability. That said, do you understand why I don't think this will work despite any feelings that may or may not exist? My life is complicated enough. Time is something I don't have to devote to a relationship. And there are other things," she added before he could speak. "You know about my illness. Even if I returned your feelings, we could never progress beyond what it was that night." Draco's face clouded. "I don't need." "Don't be an idiot," she said gently. At his skull, she reached out to take his hand and pressed it between her own. "I know it's hard to redirect emotions when they've already gained momentum. I'm asking you to, though. For both our sakes, Draco." She took a deep breath and smiled wryly at him, even though it felt like she'd swallowed a jar of snakes. "We would never work together. My goals preclude it. Really, though, that's a good thing. You're going to end up with someone a lot less crazy than me. Someone communicative and honest. Someone whose priority is you, Draco." Her friend was visibly pained, but he swallowed the hurt and lifted his chin with a staidness that would probably do his father proud, had the man been present to see it. "You are crazy," he said bluntly. "And incredibly uncommunicative, most days. I don't pretend to understand all of your priorities, Rigel. Here's what I do know, though: I've never met anyone with your intelligence, courage, patience, or tenacity. If you think you don't shine brighter than everything and everyone around you, then you don't see yourself clearly at all. After knowing you, everyone else seems smaller, with petty problems and bland personalities." Rigel opened her mouth to protest, but Draco held up his free hand. "I'm not trying to argue with you. I can feel your determination from here, and I know better than to try to change your mind when it's made up. I just want you to understand why it might take me a little while to do what you want." He slipped his other hand from her grasp and shook his head ruefully. "No matter what you say, I don't think there's anyone in the world like you." Rigel blinked the moisture back from her eyes and whispered, mouth twisting, I promise you wouldn't want to fall in love with someone like me. He grimaced, but didn't contradict her. Are we still friends, then? I've missed you, lately. She summoned a small smile. I'll be your friend as long as I can, Dre. Even that much you might regret in the end. Just don't ask me for more. This time, I really mean no. Draco peered at her, a frown tugging at his brow. Why do you feel so foreboding? Don't scowl at me, he added, you know it's a strain to turn off if you aren't occluding. Rigel rolled her eyes, but silently admitted that he was right. If she really didn't want him to read her emotions, she had the ability to prevent it. It's nothing, she said after a moment, smoothing her feelings away to a place he couldn't see them. Just an ominous feeling I have sometimes. Perhaps he would have pressed her, if Pansy hadn't walked in at that moment. As it was, they exchanged bracing smiles and left the circle of mirrors to greet her. As her friends discussed the plan for that evening's the meeting, Rigel thought at least some of the awkwardness between them had dissolved. Her heart felt lighter, and where there had been a ball of guilt and confusion in her gut there was now only a vague sense of soreness, like an infected boil that had finally been drained. That feeling, too, would fade, she thought, and soon it would be as though nothing had ever come between them. Whatever the poets said of the power of romantic affection, true friendship was something far beyond it. -0. HP. -0. Thursday. Rigel skipped lunch in favor of going to the library. She'd finally cracked open the Aura's handbook that Dawlish had given her and found a long list of recommended spells, many of which she hadn't heard of. At the end of the section on spell choice was a footnote recommending Deter, Delay, Deny, Non-Lethal Spells for Every Enemy, by Armando Dippet, and Rigel was curious to see whether Hogwarts stocked the book. She found several copies in the defense section, none of which looked terribly well worn. She supposed when it was shelved next to most riveting revenge spells and 1000 hexes and jinxes, most people overlooked the more pacifist option. Rigel smiled as she tucked one of the copies under her arm, however. The less destructive magic she knew, the better, at least until the vow no longer held her wand to the fire. She had no illusions about how the next task would be framed. There would be no third option this time, no willy interpretation of winning that might give her leeway under the vow. She could only win a duel or lose it, and losing would not be an option. On her way to Madame Pince's desk, she spotted Hermione's exuberant hair peeking over a table full of books. Rigel changed direction and peered curiously over the tall stacks. The girl was hunched over a scrap of paper and appeared to be doing furious longhand calculations, muttering under her breath as number after number appeared in the wake of her quill. "What kind of arithmancy is that?" she asked, wincing as Hermione, startled by the unexpected question, slashed ink across her paper. "Sorry." Hermione blew out a breath and scattered sand over the streak of ink quickly. "Hi, Rigel. That's all right. I'm just double-checking my calculations at this point. It's not arithmancy, it's about the fade." Rigel raised her eyebrows. "You have enough data to begin drawing conclusions." She'd tried to convince as many of her schoolmates as she could to speak to Hermione, but she hadn't honestly held out much hope that they would. The brown-eyed girl nodded, gesturing for Rigel to sit beside her. Hermione pulled a sheet of paper from between two books in the stack before her and said, "This is everything totaled. I interviewed 52 students and cross-checked everything they said against at least one other person to verify they'd remembered correctly." 52. Rigel was stunned. She hadn't known there were even 52 students in the whole school whose families had been affected by the fade. Hermione smiled, and there was a hardness to it. "I realized quickly that people who'd directly witnessed the fade weren't keen to speak about it. Your friend Selwyn did answer my letter, as did your father. Miss Bulstrode approached me on her own, and Mr. Macmillan, but everyone else I asked directly declined to talk about it. So I started asking students who didn't have anyone in their immediate family succumb to the illness. I suppose one thing in favor of the rampant bigotry in this society is that every pureblood knows a great many of the others." Rigel whistled. "So you asked people whether they knew of any families who had been affected, and if so to what extent? That's brilliant. Even about a topic as sensitive as the fade, people rarely minded talking about other people's problems." It troubled her that she hadn't known Millicent's family lost a child to the fade, but she supposed it wouldn't have come up in any casual conversation. The Weasleys gave me the idea, Hermione admitted. They freely listed everyone they knew about, so that I'd know who to approach, and that made me realize that in a society this insular, everyone would know of someone, most often more than one. By having everyone list all the cases they'd heard about, and only using those confirmed by at least one other in my data, I've done a rudimentary statistical analysis of the phenomenon. She ran her finger down each column on the sheet of parchment. No one reported any cases of the disease in a child who had at least one Muggle or Muggle-born parent. 70% of reported cases are from pureblood couples whose families have married only other purebloods for 4 generations or more. Of the remaining 30%, about half were cases where one of the parents' family had only been pure for 3 or fewer generations, and the other half were couples in which one of the parents was a half-blood. In both of the later cases, the other parent always came from a family with 4 or more generations of pureblood breeding. She looked expectantly at Rigel, whose eyes were very wide. She swallowed, then said carefully, "You appear to have narrowed it down to a single constant. In every reported case, at least one parent came from a family that was 4 or more generations pure." "That's what the numbers say," Hermione confirmed. "I've been combing the most recent Book of Gold, and I've come up with a list of every family in Great Britain whose pedigree meets that criterion." She reached into her bag and pulled out a roll of parchment. "This is all of them. Every family with a high risk of contracting the fade." "How high is the risk?" Rigel asked, almost afraid to look at the list. She was certain she'd see the names of most, if not all, of her housemates on it. "That's where the numbers get tricky," Hermione admitted. "The number of firstborns to succumb to the disease is very small. In those instances, both of the parents in question came from an extremely long line of purebloods. For the vast majority of cases, it strikes the second child born to the same parents. In instances where the couple separated or the second born was the result of an affair, cases of the fade were much less likely, particularly if the child was born of a different witch. That supports the theory that the mother's magic may have more to do with the fade than the father's," Rigel said. Hermione glared at her. "What theory is that?" "Until now, I thought it was something wizards said to make themselves feel better. Like how they used to think the female determined the sex of the child, too." Rigel shrugged apologetically. "The first instinct is always to blame the woman." Hermione huffed in amused agreement. "This time, they may have a point. It also gets more complicated if a couple continues to attempt to birth more children. There are a few cases, such as your father and uncle, where a couple had one healthy child, several fate-stricken children or miscarriages, and then another healthy child. Lord Black indicated he suspected his mother of performing some sort of black ritual to ensure his younger brother's survival. There's no way to verify that, of course." She tapped her quill on the table restlessly. "And it would have to be a very black ritual for other families to not even consider it as an alternative to losing a child," Rigel pointed out. "Perhaps it was something known only to my grandmother. I'll look through the Black family library over the winter break." There was a brief, but acute look of envy on Hermione's face at the mention of a family library. It passed after a moment, but Rigel wondered if Hermione ever wished she'd been born into an old magic family, if only for the sort of knowledge it afforded one. "I'll be doing a little more research of my own over the break, as well," Hermione said. "Healer Hurst has promised to let me look through the clinic's records and add the data to my study. The Lower Alley citizens don't keep long records of their families the way people here do," Rigel cautioned her. Hermione nodded. "Still, more data doesn't hurt. Especially more information on the exact medical progression of the disease. All this information helps us understand where the fate is likely to present, but it doesn't get us closer to curing it." "Doesn't it?" Rigel blinked. "It seems to me that the Weasleys are the wisest of us all. If every family on this list made a concentrated effort to marry a Muggle-born or half-blood this generation, the disease would be effectively eradicated for at least another 4 generations. I don't know if I'd go so far as to conclude that," Hermione said carefully. "Weren't you the one who said that most purebloods would only accept a cure that didn't force them to compromise their beliefs?" Rigel grimaced, but had to admit she was right. It's just maddening to know that, with a simple choice, no more children would have to die. It seems simple to us because it doesn't violate any beliefs we hold dear, Hermione said. There are some muggles who have a religious objection to vaccines, for instance. At Rigel's frown, she explained. Vaccines are a way of immunizing people against diseases before they catch them. Some are created with animal cells or even human cells, and there are groups of people who object to having them administered. It presents a social health risk, and it's always a tragedy when a child falls ill or dies from a preventable disease, but when someone believes something so strongly, almost nothing can change their mind. Hermione's eyes were alight, and in that moment she looked like a crusader of old, only her cross was something like the individual freedoms of all. So if we can't convince them to change their ways, the only thing to do is to cure it, Rigel concluded. She smiled ruefully. No big deal, then. Hermione laughed. She opened her mouth to say something, but they were interrupted by a gruff voice from behind them. Hermione. It was Krum, looming over them with an uncharacteristically uncertain expression on his face. He nodded briefly to Rigel, but his attention was drawn back to Hermione inexorably, and Rigel recognized the look in his eye with a jolt of surprise. Hello, Victor, Hermione said, her hands fluttering nervously before she clamped them firmly together before her stomach. How are you today? Very well, the older boy said softly. I wanted to ask you a question. Oh, all right. I'm good at questions. Hermione laughed a bit awkwardly, reached up to tuck an errant curl behind her ear, then seemed to remember her plan to keep her hands still and returned it to her lap abruptly. Her face reddened. Go ahead. Is there someone who will be escorting you to the Yule Ball? The Quidditch player's dark eyes were fixed on Hermione's face with cautious hope. Hermione coughed, as though the air in her lungs had decided to choke her of a sudden. No. Not yet. Her eyes darted toward Rigel, an expression of both panic and guilt in her eyes. No. Krum glanced suspiciously at Rigel, who blinked at him blankly before realizing he expected her to challenge him for Hermione's hand. She grimaced and turned pointedly away to stare unseeing at a nearby bookshelf. Once she heard Krum said, Then will you do me the honor, Hermione? Hermione's voice was somewhat unsteady as she said, It would be my pleasure. Thank you very much for asking, Victor. From the corner of her eye, Rigel saw Krum bow gallantly over one of Hermione's hands before smiling widely. The pleasure will be mine. He left the library, and Rigel turned back to Hermione with a feeling of cold foreboding in her stomach. How was she going to explain this to Archie? As she watched Hermione's expressed descent from embarrassed, disbelieving pleasure to utter misery, thoughts of Archie receded and all Rigel could think of was how to stop the girl in front of her from dissolving into tears. What's wrong, Hermione? Don't you like Krum? She asked carefully. Hermione's breath hitched and her lower lip trembled. Rather than cry, the girl closed her eyes tight and counted to 3 under her breath. When she opened them again, her gaze was wretched, but clear. I don't know. He's very, well. There's something alluring there. It's what I always thought I would feel, when. She shook her head and gripped her hair, her shoulders slumping in despair. I want to, you know. I want Harry. Rigel froze, utterly sure that she had no more idea how to navigate this particular conversation than she had the last time. Hermione didn't appear to need her input, however, as she continued. Harry was my first friend. Yes, he understands me better than anyone. Harry is so much more than I ever thought one person could be. More outgoing, more earnest, fun, kind, protective, smart. Hermione let out a watery laugh. God, but Harry is so smart. Perfect. Almost. But without physical attraction, it's just friendship, isn't it? Not romance. After a moment Rigel realized she was expected to respond. She shrugged helplessly. I don't know anything about romance. Really, I'm the worst person to ask. Hermione's heartbreakingly torn expression ate away at her reluctance to get involved, and she added, if you really want my opinion, I think, be with who makes you happy. Whoever makes you feel whole. And maybe you don't know who that is yet. And that's okay, too. Rigel thought no one should have to decide about forever when they were 15. Hermione considered her words with a solemn expression. I do like Victor. Maybe it's just hormones, but I won't know unless I try, will I? Something firmed in her eyes and she nodded slowly to herself. It'll be an experiment, then. If I can puzzle through how I feel with different people, then maybe I'll figure out what it is I really need. Thanks, Rigel. She began to pack up her notes, and Rigel realized the lunch period was probably almost over. Rigel picked up her book, and was about to leave when Hermione added, "Who will you take to the ball, then?" Rigel frowned. "What ball?" Hermione stared at her. "The one Victor just asked me to." "The Yule Ball." "I assumed that was some kind of Durmstrang thing." The statement came out as a question as Hermione's expression turned exasperated. "I'm starting to feel as though there's a mailing list I've been left off of." "The Yule Ball is scheduled the night after the third task," Hermione told her. "It's to celebrate the 3 blood champions and the halfway point for the tournament." "Do you really not know about it?" "McGonagall told me weeks ago." She groaned. "Snape probably cares less than I do." "Is it mandatory?" Hermione laughed. "The champions are to open the dancing, so I would say so." Rigel scowled in displeasure, but the scowl fell into a blank expression as Hermione added, "Will Harry come?" Rigel had the sudden realization that rampaging hippogriffs wouldn't be able to keep her cousin away. All she said was, "We are engaged, so it would be proper." "Did Harry tell you about that?" Hermione made a noise of affirmation. "Harry said it was arranged but not serious." "That's right," Rigel confirmed quickly. "There's never been that sort of attachment between us. Harry's more like my sibling than anything. The engagement was drawn up as soon as we found out about the S.O.Ws marriage law, just in case. For protection," Hermione said, eyes wide. "I see. That's quite a sacrifice for you, isn't it?" "No more than it is for Harry." Rigel shrugged. "Anyway, it's not forever. Only until we're 17, as long as the legislation is killed once and for all before then." "Do you think it will be?" Hermione asked, eyes penetrating. "I aim to see it so." -0. HP. -0. Between free brewing with Snape, training her reflexes in the room of requirement, and wrapping up a number of other projects in preparation for the end of term, the remaining week before the third task passed all too quickly. Before she felt fully resigned to it, Rigel found herself walking down to the pitch through the early morning fog, frost crunching beneath her trusty boots. In addition to her Hogwarts jersey and loose breeches, she wore an underlayer of warm silk that she hoped would prevent her muscles seizing in the freezing air. A part of her wished she was back in the alleys, that this was just another day spent in the courtyard of the Dancing Phoenix with her friends, but she willed those thoughts away firmly. She had to distance herself from that person. Harry the Alfreduilla couldn't be anywhere near the tournament stage that day. Draco and Pansy walked on either side of her, silently supportive, and in the distance, she could see the stands already filling up with spectators. "Are your parents coming to watch today?" she asked them, more for something to break the tense atmosphere than anything. "Of course." Draco looked offended that she would even ask. "They wouldn't miss it. Or did you forget again that you're family?" Rigel smiled, but said, "I asked my family not to come to this one, actually. It's too much pressure with them watching." Draco frowned. "Since when does pressure get to you?" After a moment's shrewd contemplation, he said, "You just don't like people fussing over you." "Well, I'll tell Mother and Father not to overwhelm you, but what else can you expect when you risk your life and limb in front of all and sundry?" "It wasn't Rigel's choice, exactly," Pansy said, defensive on her behalf. "I don't mind your parents' version of fussing," Rigel said, a small laugh escaping her. "Sirius would wrap me in a bubble charm if he could." "Rigel." They all three turned to see Ju hurrying down from the castle behind them. Draco made an annoyed noise under his breath, but didn't stop Rigel from waiting for the girl to catch up to them. "Hi, Ju," she said. "Hi." The girl panted a bit, but caught her breath enough to say, "I just wanted to wish you luck today. Ravenclaw is supporting you, no matter what happens." "Thank you," Rigel said, genuinely touched. Never had she imagined the school could rally around her like it had. She'd expected so much more resentment for being chosen over older, better-liked students like Cedric Diggory. "I'll do my best to represent Hogwarts proudly." I'm sure you will. Ju's voice was still a little breathless, and her eyes darted between Rigel, Draco, and Pansy nervously before she blurted, "Do you have a date to the ball?" Rigel's lips parted, but nothing came out for a long moment. Ju turned red, disappointment creeping into her eyes. "I mean, you probably do. I just thought I'd ask. In case you didn't." Rigel summoned a smile despite the awkwardness she felt internally. Ju was only trying to be nice, after all. If she hadn't had anyone to go with, she'd have been grateful to accept the girl's offer. "It's very kind of you to think of me," she said warmly. "Since I'm engaged to Heiress Potter, though, I'll be escorting her." She'd already discussed it with Archie, and he was prepared to play Harry for the evening. Rigel thought some crazy part of her cousin was actually looking forward to it, from the mischievous gleam that had entered his eyes as they discussed the possibility. It worried her a little, but in light of the portion of Riddle's magic that Dom had yet to filter from her core, they had no other choice. Ju murmured something understanding and fled quickly toward the Quidditch pitch. Rigel peered after her with a somewhat puzzled expression and heard Draco snort from beside her. She slid a glance toward him. "What? You really are the worst," he muttered. There was more amusement in his voice than censure, though. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, unsure what she was supposed to be apologizing for. "Ignore him," Pansy said, looping her arm through Rigel's. "Focus on the task." Rigel didn't miss the look Pansy shot Draco behind her back, but she didn't know what to make of it, so she did as her friend suggested and bent her attention to the upcoming ordeal. They'd all been officially informed of the nature of the third task 3 days before. Rigel wasn't sure what advantage Riddle thought an extra week and a half to prepare was supposed to have bought her, but she suspected he merely wanted her to feel beholden to him. That was his game, after all. Make people trust him by bestowing small favors on them, then take advantage of the impulse toward reciprocity. Rigel refused to be fooled. She also refused to feel guilty about any supposed advantage his words tried to bestow on her. Draco was muttering last-minute strategy in her ear, and she humored him by listening, but she knew general strategy would be secondary to direct observation. The first match she would be going in blind, but every subsequent match she would have some notion of her opponent's style, simply by watching the others fight. She left Draco and Pansy at the stairs to the stands and made her way to the center of the pitch alone. A large, perfectly circular platform had been raised there, not as high as the obstacle course had been, but elevated enough to give a better view to the spectators above them. The other champions waited in a loose circle in the shadow of the stage, and when Rigel joined them, Crouch cleared his throat. "Now that we are all present, the task will proceed as follows. Granger and Sousa will duel first, followed by Crumb and Zahai, Delacour and Antiope, and finally Shang and Black." Crouch raised his voice to cut across the murmurs. "Owens, being in the lead currently, will get a bye the first round. The tournament is elimination style until the final round, so second round matches will be directly determined by the results of round 1. Bagman cut in with a broad smile. "That is to say, the winner of the first match will face the winner of the second match, and so on. Someone else will get a bye in the second round, of course, but that will be determined at random." Sure it would, Rigel thought cynically. She didn't miss the fact that both Muggleborns who hadn't been given a bye in the first round were on the same side of the bracket. At best, it meant only one of them would make it to the final round. Hermione's face was set with determination, but Rigel wondered how much time the girl had really been devoting to preparing for the tournament on top of her investigation into the Fade. She couldn't fault the girl's priorities, but she worried for her safety. The Triwizard Tournament was, she thought, not a place for good people. Hermione and Matthews climbed the steps up to the platform as the crowd began to thunderously communicate its approval. Crouch and Bagman directed the rest of them toward the edge of the pitch, where a staircase led them to their own private box from which they could view the duels. After just a few short minutes, Bagman's amplified voice counted down the moments to the beginning of the duel. Hermione's stance was almost textbook, but she leaned slightly away from her opponent rather than toward him. Lack of aggression, Rigel thought. While initiative wasn't everything in a duel, it was harder to control the pace when you began on the defensive. 2, 1, begin. Hermione had a shield up before the echo of Bagman's voice had faded from the stadium, but Matthews merely stared at her, not moving, from across the ring. He spun his wand in idly, and faint laughter came down from the stands. The aim girl scowled, clearly torn between keeping her shield up just in case and dropping it so that the magic didn't drain her unnecessarily. It was smart of Matthews to use her indecision against her. As long as she kept the shield up, she'd wear away at her own endurance. Finally, with an impatient flick, Hermione dropped the shield and sent a wordless disarming spell at Matthews. The Brazilian boy was all the way on the other side of the ring, and had plenty of time to dodge the spell. She sent another, then two more in quick succession, but Matthews sidestepped them all without bothering to shield. "Get closer," Rigel muttered. Hermione was only going to wear herself out at that distance. The girl seemed to realize Matthews could dodge faster than she could cast, for she broke off the point spell offense and instead lifted her hands into the air dramatically. A dozen small boulders materialized in the space above her head, and a sharp jab with her wand sent them hailing down toward Matthews. The spectators cheered at seeing such an advanced conjuration, and Rigel clapped along with them. It was smart, using an attack that covered such a wide area precluded physical avoidance. The dark-haired boy finally lifted his wand and it bobbed in the air like a conductor's baton for a moment before a shimmering barrier of a type Rigel had never seen before appeared between him and the falling rocks. It didn't shield him so much as it spun the incoming projectiles off course and deflected them away. It was as though he'd created a localized twister out of the air before him. A few of the rocks shot sideways and came to rest at the edge of the woods surrounding the stage. The rest fell somewhere between the two duelists. Hermione set about transfiguring the rock closest to her, and Rigel's eyebrows rose. To transfigure something you'd already conjured was a very advanced application of magic. A cloud of smoke momentarily obscured the girl, and when it cleared, they could see the rock had burst into a dozen shards. Hermione banished them with an audible cry. They rocketed toward Matthews, and for a moment it seemed the fast-moving pieces would cut through the wind barrier. At the last moment, they were turned aside. Hermione stood at the ready position, but didn't cast another spell. A moment later, Matthews flinched violently and his barrier dissolved as he ducked his head and waved his arms wildly against something Rigel couldn't see. Hermione had a spell off the moment the boy dropped his barrier in distraction, and abruptly, it was over. Matthews caught the disarming spell in the back and crumpled. "I'm not sure what we just saw, but Hermione Granger has won the first duel." The stadium erupted, and Rigel breathed a sigh of relief that Hermione had made it through the first round unscathed. "What was that?" Fleur demanded, glaring down at the pitch as though the duel had personally offended her. "I could not see what happened." Tariel laughed. "It was clever. Did you see the smoke when Hermione transfigured that rock? It was a screen. I felt two spells, not one. The invisible thing that attacked Matthews must have come from that moment." "She surprised him when he let his guard down," Crumb said. There was a pleased note in his voice. Antiope scoffed. "It was still a boring duel. I hope you two provide us some more entertainment," she added, giving Crumb and Tariel a mocking look. Tariel was utterly unfazed. "We will certainly do our best, Antiope. Will you cheer for me?" The redhead sneered at him. "Not a chance. I want to face Crumb in the finals." Fleur tossed her hair with a huff. "Getting ahead of yourself, are you not?" Antiope's only response was a confident smirk. "This task was made for me. You're all using just your wands, but I petitioned the judges to be allowed use of my sword." Several of the others protested, but Antiope only laughed. "It's only right that I be able to show my skills to their best advantage. If any of you had trained with a weapon, you could have used it just the same." "Free dueling is disgraceful," Fleur said. The fierce disgust in her voice didn't wholly disguise the trepidation in her eyes, though. "It is the noblest of all arts," Antiope spat. "Only countries who have forgotten how to do it think it's beneath them. Luckily, this is an international tournament, so your close-minded rules don't apply. I'll prove to everyone watching today that steel is vital to true combat." The appearance of Hermione at the top of the stairs forestalled the argument. Rigel went over to congratulate her, with Crumb right on her heels. Hermione gave them a weak smile. "It wasn't great," she murmured. "I didn't realize what it would be like, dueling for real." "You've a wonderful," Crumb rumbled. "Very advanced magic." "Matthews wasn't even trying," Hermione said with a sigh. Thanks, though. Good luck in your match, Victor. He took her hand and kissed it despite the sweat and dirt. If you are watching, I will win. The frustration melted from the girl's face and she nodded. I'll cheer you on. Crumb and Tariel left the box, and Hermione's face hardened again. Be honest, Rigel. How did I do? You were a little timid, Rigel said kindly. You hung back on your side of the ring without moving closer. If you'd been casting from halfway across, for instance, he wouldn't have had time to dodge your spells. Hermione winced, but nodded. Rigel went on. Your quick thinking was impressive, though. That sort of creativity can't be taught. I'm sure the judges were impressed with your conjuring and transfiguration. Can I ask what spell you got Matthews with in the end? Avis, she said, smiling sheepishly. I just conjured them invisibly and sent them around the barrier to dive at him from behind. Brilliant, Rigel said, smiling back. Not many people can alter a spell before casting it. Harry would be so impressed. Hermione flushed. I'll wait to feel pleased with myself until we see how the next round goes. Just don't be afraid to move around, really use the whole platform, Rigel said. The barriers won't let you fall off the edge. Hermione nodded. The next duel is starting, she said, and they both moved to the edge of the box with the other champions to watch. Tariel still had his irrepressible smile on his face, while Crumb, whose dueling stance was slightly lower than Rigel would have expected for a boy with his height, was the picture of solemn concentration. At Bagman's word, the two boys sprang into action. Crumb darted forward, aiming two spells in swift succession to either side of Tariel. Trying to pin him in place, Rigel guessed. Tariel batted at the air with one of his hands, however, and the spell that would have impacted to his left met an invisible force and reflected. As Tariel moved left, Crumb was forced to roll under his own spell. By the time he stood, Tariel was behind him. Crumb cast a shield at his back without looking, and as Tariel's first spell fizzled harmlessly against it, he spun, catching the dark-skinned boy with a flipendo that hurled Tariel into the air and deposited him clear across the stage. Tariel held up a hand toward his opponent as he climbed slowly to his feet, and every spell Crumb shot at him rebounded from the invisible defense. With his free hand, Tariel began casting. It was eerie to watch spells appear from the end of a person's fingertips, Rigel noted. Stranger still to watch the boy cast wandlessly over and over again, a feat that would exhaust most wand users she knew before long. Tariel was still smiling, though his eyes held a wary respect for Crumb that had been absent before. Crumb grew tired of avoiding both his own spells and Tariel's. The broad-shouldered Bulgarian stopped casting point spells and instead aimed his wand at the stage. A torrent of water burst from his wand like a flood, catching Tariel up to the knees and forcing him to stop casting and brace against the hard current to avoid being swept off his feet. Crumb was all the time chanting something, and beginning from his side of the platform the water, trapped by the wards at the edge of the stage, began to freeze. Tariel clambered onto one of Hermione's boulders to keep from getting stuck in the ice. By the time he'd reached the higher ground, Crumb had conjured skates on the bottom of his boots and was gliding across the arena as though he'd been born doing it. He closed the distance between them in moments, and none of Tariel's spells could hit him, and he pivoted and slid back and forth on the frozen platform. He changed the terrain to suit him, Hermione said wonderingly. Rigel agreed. He's too fast on those skates for Tariel to hit him now. The Somali boy seemed to have realized the same thing. He lowered his hands, seemed to shudder violently for an instant, and then he was folding in on himself, transforming, Rigel realized. Her mouth fell open without her consent as Tariel, now a spotted hyena, leapt from the rock and knocked Crumb from his feet. The crowd went mad, shock and awe giving way to wild excitement as it became clear just what Tariel was truly capable of. Both boy and hyena rolled across the ice, and the hyena was the first to rise. The animagus gave a woo-op call and used its clawed feet to restlessly pace the ice until Crumb, one hand gingerly poking the back of his skull, regained his feet. Crumb eyed the animal warily, slowly circling on his skates. He cast a stunner at the hyena, but the large canine nimbly avoided it, something like a laugh escaping the powerful jaws. Tariel made a small bound toward Crumb, then away again, feinting left, then right as Crumb tried to decide which way to go. More laughing followed, and Rigel could see Crumb's frustration even from her vantage point. The Bulgarian's wand flurried into motion and a thick net sprung out toward the animagus. Tariel came back on his hind legs and batted it out of the air, coming down on top of the net and using the extra purchase on the ice to leap forward. Crumb conjured a physical shield, but the force of the hyena's weight bore him backwards onto the ice anyway. As his head hit the ice a second time, the shield failed and Tariel's jaw clamped around Crumb's wand arm. He twitched his head the barest amount, and Crumb's wand fell from limp fingers, spinning across the ice. Rigel thought Crumb would surrender. Tariel must have expected it, too, as the animagus released Crumb's arm and whooped loudly into the sky. As the hyena's head came back down, Crumb punched him in the snout. A sickening yelp rang out and Tariel scrambled back, but Crumb found the strength to follow him. The Bulgarian tackled the hyena, wrapped thick arms around Tariel's neck, and summoned his wand. When the tip of his wand pressed into the animagus fur, Tariel froze, then slowly shifted back to human form. Crumb didn't let up. He gripped Tariel by the jaw and exposed his throat for all to see, the wand point digging into the vulnerable skin there. Stunned applause filled the pitch as Bagman said, "There you have it. Victor Crumb claims the second match." The boys separated at once, Crumb going so far as to help Tariel to his feet on the slippery ice. Impossibly, the slighter boy still had a grin on his face. Healers took charge of both of them as they left the wards, and a small break was called as tournament organizers were sent to clean up the stage for the next match. Rigel exchanged a look with Hermione. "Crumb did well," she said. "He never gave up," Hermione agreed, respect in her eyes. "Tariel, though, do you think he went easy on Victor?" Rigel's eyebrows rose. "He used his animagus form. I don't think he was holding back." Hermione seemed unconvinced. "I read somewhere that hyenas have stronger jaws than a bear. If Tariel wanted to, he could have ripped Victor's arm clean off." "He wouldn't do that," though, Rigel said reassuringly. "These are exhibition matches, Hermione, not fights to the death. No one should be aiming to maim or kill. Tariel did his best within reasonable limits. That's all any of us should do." She didn't know if she was trying to convince Hermione or herself of that. By the time the third match was ready to start, Crumb had been released from the healer's care and rejoined them in the champion's box. Hermione congratulated him for his win, but Crumb did not seem wholly satisfied with it. "I am not sure he wanted to win," the older boy muttered when pressed. Rigel couldn't speak to Tariel's motivations, but she didn't think lack of heart would be an issue in the next match. Fleur and Antiope stared each other down like mortal enemies, for all that they'd only known one another a couple of months. Antiope did indeed have her sword, an impressively sturdy weapon that she hefted one-handed in her left hand, her wand clutched tightly in her right. Fleur appeared undaunted, though Rigel suspected that was mostly out of pride. The girl's disdain for weaponed combat indicated she had no familiarity with it, and Rigel knew from personal experience what a jarring difference it could make in a duel. "Who do you think will win?" Hermione asked from beside her. Rigel felt bad saying it, but there was no point in dishonesty. "Antiope. If she's half as good with that sword as she thinks she is, it'll mess up everything Fleur's been trained to." "Why is free dueling banned in Britain, anyway?" Hermione asked curiously. She lowered her voice and added, "I've heard Healer Hurst mention it once or twice. A lot of the injuries we see at the clinic are from such illicit duels." Rigel nodded. "Part of it is because it causes so many injuries. The added element of complexity that comes when you introduce weapons, potions, and other forms of magic into a duel can exponentially increase the probability of lethal harm, even when both participants know what they are doing." "And the other part?" Hermione asked shrewdly. "Old-fashioned prejudice," Rigel said with a faint smile. "Wizards like to think they are too good to use anything Muggle in their traditions. Relying on something other than one's own magic is, for some, the sign of a weak wizard. Magic is might, and all that." Hermione groaned. "That phrase alone makes me want to take up a sword myself." "Maybe Antiope will teach you," Rigel said with amusement. "Maybe I'll get the king to teach me," Hermione said, laughing quietly. Rigel froze, then immediately tried to disguise her alarm with a casual tone. "King?" Hermione shot her a guilty glance. "Never mind. I think, maybe it's something I'm not supposed to mention." She sighed. "I don't understand everything about the lower alleys yet." "Have you asked Harry?" she asked. Whatever Hermione might have said, it was lost in the roar of the stands as the third match began. Antiope charged. Fleur began casting, probably as fast as she could, but Antiope darted around every spell without ceasing her relentless advance. The fact that she wasn't blocking the spells outright with her sword made Rigel think it probably wasn't imbued with the same ability to absorb magic that Gold Flames had been. By the time Fleur realized Antiope wasn't going to be stopped, the redhead was upon her. She slashed viciously through the air and the beautiful blonde girl barely managed to leap out of the way in time. Fleur retreated, shielding against the next several attacks as she steadily backed her way to one end of the platform. With a scowl of frustration, Fleur conjured a thick, earthen wall between her and her opponent. Antiope made to go around it, but Fleur cast a bombarder at her own transfiguration and it exploded outward, burying Antiope in dirt. As the redhead struggled out of the debris, Fleur took the time to conjure a shield of pure magic and affix it to her left arm. By the time Antiope had regained her feet, Fleur was ready. She met Antiope's next strike with her shield, but Rigel could see the way the impact reverberated through the Partvila's slim frame. Antiope rained blows down on the girl again and again, and Rigel had to wonder if the freckled warrior was just toying with the French woman. Antiope hadn't cast a single spell yet, using only her sword to batter at Fleur's defenses over and over. She certainly was out to prove something. The physical blows visibly tired Fleur, who had taken to hiding behind the shield as often as she attempted to cast. Antiope had uncanny reflexes, and a way of sliding out of the way of spells even when they were fired almost point blank. The Beauxbatons champion couldn't get space to breathe, let alone come up with a viable strategy in the face of Antiope's relentless pursuit. Really, it wasn't too surprising when Antiope gripped her sword in both hands and finally brought it down with enough force to break through the conjured shield and bite into Fleur's biceps. The silvery blonde girl fell to her knees, cradling her bleeding arm, and Antiope moved her sword to the place above Fleur's heart. The French girl glared up at Antiope from her defeated position, but Antiope merely shook her head, waiting until Bagman had officially declared her the victor before lowering her weapon. "She didn't cast a single spell," Hermione said, clearly marveled. "Her style gave her an overwhelming advantage against a dueler like Fleur," Rigel said ruefully. "It seems as though her advantage would be the same against any of us." Hermione appeared troubled. "I hope I don't face her in the second round." Rigel hummed, but didn't say anything. She sort of hoped Hermione didn't face her, too, but she didn't want to undermine the girl's confidence. She glanced across the box at Ftian, who gave her a small smile. "Now is our turn," the Asian girl said. She was dressed warmly, in a long tunic and thick leggings, and her long, black hair had been pulled back from her face in a bun. Rigel nodded. "Shall we?" She followed the slightly shorter girl down the spiral stairs and onto the grassy pitch. The stage loomed large and intimidating ahead of them, but Rigel felt more anticipation than fear as she climbed the stairs to the top. Dark forests and obstacle courses were not really her forte. This, though. The look of determination in her opponent's eyes, the feel of her wand gripped securely in her fist, the sturdy, even platform beneath her feet, this she knew. Ftian's stance was wide, almost dramatically so. Rigel favored a loser, partial crouch that kept her centered without sacrificing maneuverability. When Bagman called for them to start, it was a long moment before either girl actually moved. Rigel darted right, and watched as Ftian matched her with sweeping footwork that explained her wide stance. A tripping jinx bloomed effortless from her wand and she carefully watched as Ftian turned around it. There was something lovely about the economy of movement the dark-haired girl displayed, as though she were merely following a pattern long committed to memory. Rigel wanted to know what that pattern was. She teased Ftian's defenses, casting first to the girl's left, then to her right, then high and low, sizing up the nature of her response to each spell. Most of the time, Ftian opted to dance around it rather than block it. Rigel moved closer, her spells coming faster, and Ftian's footwork sped up in response. The girl was well trained. When Ftian's first spell came, it was not one Rigel had ever heard before. A cloud formed between them and ice particles that had seemingly condensed within it shot out at Rigel. She summoned magic to heat the air around her, and when the attack finally reached her it was but the sting of fast raindrops. She sent an incarcerus toward Ftian, but the girl turned away from the spell even as she cast another, unrecognizable spell toward Rigel's feet. The solid platform beneath her turned to mud, and Rigel promptly sank 3 inches. She conjured a fortis shield to protect her as she pulled her boots free with a squelch and froze the mud directly below her feet with a spell from her free hand. Fthian shot several fireballs her direction, but the fortis repelled them easily. When Rigel dropped the shield to prepare her next spell, the Chinese girl turned to the air once more, calling up a torrent of rain over Rigel's head with a swirl of her wand. Rigel's clothes were instantly soaked through, and she realized the other girl was playing the long game. In the frigid December temperature, the rain clung to Rigel's bones and forced her to consciously ignore the impulse to shiver and slow. The rain also made the mud on her half of the platform much more slippery. The rain didn't stop her from sending 2 relashos in quick succession, however. Fthian's footwork saved her from both spells, but Rigel had the time she needed to leap over the remaining mud and shorten the distance between them. She pressed forward with spell after spell, forcing Fthian onto the defensive while she closed the gap. When she was close enough to see the consternation in Fthian's eyes, Rigel tried a trip jinx again. The other girl did stumble, but not before hissing, "Fen," at her with a sharp jab of her wand. A gust of wind lifted Rigel off her feet and knocked the breath from her lungs as it deposited her back the short distance she'd just gained. "So Fen means Venchus," she noted sourly as she rolled with the fall through the waiting mud and came up on the defensive. Fthian had already cast her next attack, fire again, this time a litany of small, burning hail that forced Rigel to call up another shield. With her free hand, Rigel reached beneath her to etch a basic state change rune into the muck. The water evaporated from it instantly, leaving a layer of dry dirt behind instead. Rigel gripped a handful of the dirt and, when the fireballs had stopped, dropped her shield. She flung the dust into the air, banishing it in a rocketing cloud toward Fthian with careful control. It caught her in the face, and the girl spluttered and coughed, eventually choking out the wind spell again to disperse it. By the time the cloud was gone, Rigel was halfway across the platform again, an impedimenta on the tip of her wand. Fthian swirled around the spell with one of her curious, sweeping half-turns, and Rigel heard her say, "Fen." She was ready this time. Rigel flung a Venchus with as much force as she could muster in the space of a second. It met Fthian's wind spell head-on and overpowered it, knocking the pale girl off her feet with an audible oof. Fthian was so close to the edge of the platform, Rigel's spell slammed her into the woods and she slumped to the floor with a groan. Rigel summoned the girl's wand, and found herself almost disappointed with how quickly the match had gone. Then she shook her head at her own foolishness. She should be grateful to not have tired herself out in the first match. Cheers rained down on her from the stands, and Rigel summoned a smile as she helped Fthian to her feet and handed her back the wand she'd taken. "You all right?" she asked. Fthian nodded, shooting Rigel a rueful look. "I am well. Only shamed." "It was a good match," Rigel said. The girl shook her head, but did not seem overly disappointed. "After task number 2, there was small chance I advance. Now, at least, I can go home." Rigel made a non-committal noise and they exited the platform as Bagman announced a short break while the second round matches were decided. She was shivering with the drenching she'd had, but otherwise uninjured, so the healers let her go back up to the champion's box after a very thorough drying spell, a heated blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Round 2 will begin with Owens versus Granger," Bagman informed them all. "Black and Antiope will duel second, and Crumb receives a bye." Rigel wondered whether that decision was based on Crumb having incurred the most severe injuries during the first round. She supposed it wouldn't be the worst way to decide, though it didn't escape her that the Muggle-born candidates were exclusively matched against one another. Hermione seemed, if anything, more nervous in the face of her second match than she had been before the first. Rigel thought the girl hadn't known quite what to expect the first time. She wished the AIM girl luck, but Hermione only grimaced at her before descending the stairs once more. It was clear from the start that Owens had a great deal of training. The American boy took the initiative at once, with a handful of not particularly dangerous spells that nevertheless came one after the other fast enough to keep Hermione on the defensive. The girl was being herded slowly toward the end of the platform, and Rigel doubted she even realized how many steps back she'd taken until her back came up against the wards. Hermione took a Tarantallegra without shielding in favor of getting time to cast a spell of her own. The ground beneath Owen's feet heaved, throwing the boy off his feet. Hermione cast a quick finite on her jerking legs and dove around the boy's next spell, which boiled through the air where she'd just been. When Owens regained his feet, Hermione had switched their places and clearly hoped to box him against the wards instead. Owens blocked each one of her spells with split-second shields that he called up and released in the space between instants. Rigel had never seen someone shield so fast before. The flickering technique probably saved him a lot of magic in the long run, she thought, but it had to take exemplary concentration and reflexes to get the shield up just in time to meet each of the spells Hermione hurled at him. Certainly, the strategy was having an impact on the girl's morale. Rigel hoped she found a way around Owen's defenses before frustration drove her to something desperate. Finally, Hermione cast a spell that Owens couldn't shield against, Conjuration, again, this time 2 small dogs that raced toward her opponent with lolling tongues. They closed on Owens from 2 different directions, but the boy swept his wand out with a vicious slash and something like a slicing charm swept out around him in a horizontal arc. It cut right through the conjured animals, severing their bloodless heads, and Hermione froze in momentary shock before stumbling backwards to avoid the tail end of the cutting spell as it dissipated. Owens didn't give her a chance to regain her equilibrium. He began to cast again, almost lazily at first, and then faster and faster, battering Hermione's shield such that she couldn't risk dropping it to retaliate. His spells were not so innocuous any longer, Reductos and Bombarders replaced jinxes meant to slow or impede. Hermione lost ground, and, eventually, her shield slipped. She jumped backwards as it failed, but couldn't escape the full range of a confringo that exploded at her feet. Hermione was propelled across the platform, and the limp way she rolled to a stop told Rigel the girl was no longer in full control of her faculties. There was a sickening silence as Owens walked closer to where Hermione lay, gasping weakly. The girl attempted to raise her wand, but it shook in her fingers. The American boy paused, and Rigel thought he would disarm her. He didn't. The spell that came out of his wand was Flipendo, and it impacted Hermione's chest point blank with a sickening crunch. Rigel let out an involuntary sound as Hermione's body was flung backwards so hard she hit the wards with a second crunch and crumpled unmoving to the stone stage. The stadium erupted at the sudden violence, and Bagman hastily declared, "The match is over. Owens advances." Owens left the platform without looking back. Healers descended on Hermione's supine form, and Rigel waited in the grip of fear for her to move. "Please, Merlin, let her move." A hand on Rigel's shoulder jerked her back from where she'd leaned dangerously over the railing and she inhaled sharply. It was Crumb's hand. She didn't know when he'd been released from the medical tent, but when she glanced back, she saw that his face expressed exactly the murderous anger Rigel felt flailing helplessly inside her. Muted clapping drew her eyes back to the stage, where Hermione was sitting up. A healer held a wand to her chest, and the girl was visibly struggling to breathe, but she was alive. Rigel slowly unclenched her hands from their death grip on wood between her and the pitch, and by the time Jacob Owens had climbed the stairs to the champion's box, Rigel was pretty sure she didn't want to maim him much. She wasn't above giving him her best glare as he casually said, "It's your turn next, isn't it?" Rigel tucked the anger away, knowing it would not help her in the fight against Antiope. There was no smothering it entirely, however, and it simmered in the back of her mind, ready in case she needed it later. She felt almost naked stepping up to the platform without a knife in her left hand. Antiope's sword was, if possible, even more intimidating when the redhead brandished it toward her across the stage. Rigel took a moment before Bagman began his countdown to tighten the long gauntlet on her left hand, grateful that the top plate extended nearly halfway up her forearm. There was no doubt this match would test its workmanship even further than her encounter with the werewolf had. 1. Begin. Antiope sprinted straight at her. Rigel had been charged by bigger people than her before, and stood her ground. Having seen the redhead dance nimbly around Fleur's spells, Rigel went for a broader approach. She conjured a net of fine steel links and banished at Antiope in the next breath. The girl sliced through it without stopping, proving beyond a doubt just how wickedly sharp that sword was. Rigel realized with sudden surprise that the girl had checked her strength when she struck Fleur. Otherwise, the sword would have bitten clean through her chest. When Antiope was almost on top of her, Rigel called up a swirling cloud of black smoke. Snape had taught her the spell, and the only downside was that without her enchanted glasses, Rigel couldn't see through it either. It did stop her opponent's charge, as even Antiope was not reckless enough to run where she couldn't see. As Rigel was about to take the opportunity to put space between them again, a spell she recognized boiled at her through the black cloud. She ducked beneath it and dove forward to escape the resultant explosion. Her roll took her through the opaque cloud and into Antiope's booted feet. The girl gave a grunt of surprise and swung at Rigel in wild reflex, but she was ready with a shield that flung the girl back, sword and all, as it bloomed from her wand right into Antiope's personal space. Rigel released the shield before it had even fully formed, choosing to press her advantage as Antiope quick-stepped backwards to regain her balance. She cast 3 stunners with barely a pause, aiming each one in a slightly different place so that the girl could not avoid all 3 with one move. Antiope's footwork could have made even Draco blush with envy, though, as she lunged and twisted around the oncoming spells. Her last spell went over Antiope's head as the stocky girl ducked under it and swung her sword up to try and get under Rigel's guard. Rather than shield again, Rigel slammed her left hand down and to the side, meeting the blade with her gauntlet and redirecting Antiope's sword with sheer force. It was more surprise than anything that let her succeed, she thought, as Antiope's sword bounced off and away. Rigel didn't waste the second of shock that widened her opponent's eyes. She shot a stunner point blank at the girl's chest and watched, unwillingly impressed, as Antiope's reflexes took over and the girl fell backwards in a truly beautiful backbend. The girl's left foot came up with a sweep as she did, and Rigel jumped back a step to avoid a boot to the face. Rigel could do little more than gape as Antiope reversed her momentum on her right foot alone, her left leg arching forward to force her upright again before joining its pair on the ground in what was, she realized with a disbelieving smile, a perfect dueling stance. Incredible, Rigel breathed. Shut up. Antiope cast a bombarder and Rigel called up a reflecting shield to send it straight back at her. The girl stepped back and to the side to let it sail over her shoulder and impact with a boom against the wards some 20 feet behind her. There was a brief pause as both girls stared one another down. Rigel wasn't sure what tactic to use with someone as skilled as Antiope. There would be no getting around her footwork, and she seemed to seamlessly transition between sword and wand when necessary. Rigel would have to surprise her, she thought. Antiope was clearly resizing Rigel as well. The girl brought her hands together and gripped her sword between both of them, her wand trapped parallel to the sword's hilt beneath her right palm. With a battle cry, the girl charged again, her chin-length hair flying wildly behind her. If Rigel thought Antiope wouldn't be able to cast with her wand pinned to the sword pommel, she was mistaken. Before she could consider how to defend against the sword, a stunning spell came jetting toward her along the trajectory of its point. Rigel hastily got a shield up to intercept the spell. It held easily, but a moment later the sword came whooshing down. Rigel braced herself against the reverberations of such a strong blow impacting the fortis, but Antiope's sword barely slowed when it touched the edge of the shimmering shield. Rigel yelped and twisted to the side with enough desperate force to strain several abdominal muscles simultaneously. The sword missed her neck, though, continuing down with enough force to clang against the stone floor as Rigel dragged herself sideways. She sprinted away from the girl and her shield-eating sword, her heart thumping in her chest at the inexplicably close call. What in Merlin's name had happened? Rigel had seen Fleur's shield hold up against Antiope's sword several times. For that matter, Rigel's own shield had deflected Antiope's sword just minutes earlier. What had changed? Rigel eyed the redhead across the healthy distance she'd put between them, and her gaze was drawn to the two-handed grip Antiope had on her sword. That's it, she thought. She'd switched to a two-handed grip when she broke through Fleur's shield, too. Something about it gave her sword that extra ability. Rigel had never heard of anything that could just slice through protective magic like that, but then, she was well aware that the world was full of more things than she'd personally catalogued in her short life. Armed with renewed caution, Rigel cast several impedimentas in quick succession, hoping that if she could slow the girl down, even for a short period of time, she might gain the upper hand. Antiope ducked and dipped around each of them without trying. Perfect footwork, she reminded herself. Ranged attacks gave her too much time to dodge, and close-in combat gave her the advantage. Really, Rigel thought, this task had been made for a witch like Antiope. Well, Rigel was not afraid of close dueling either. She cast a few moderate dueling spells, but ultimately allowed Antiope to eliminate the space between them. She met the girl's next strike with the back of her gauntlet, using her right hand to brace her left and her slight height advantage to bear down on the girl until she disengaged. Antiope audibly growled as she came back for a second strike, this time toward Rigel's right side. She spun into the attack, dropping her wand from her right hand to her left and using the momentum from her pivot to counter the force of the redhead's blow, this time with her right gauntlet. She was casting a disarming charm with her left hand before Antiope's sword had even finished connecting, forcing the girl to let go of the pommel with her wand hand in order to simultaneously attack and shield. As soon as Antiope switched to a one-handed grip on the sword, Rigel summoned her own shield and slammed it against Antiope's with as much force as she could summon. The redhead, not anticipating the physical assault, cried out as her unanchored shield was slapped backwards into her face. The unmistakable crunch of a broken nose made Rigel wince, but Antiope's sword descended like an avenging angel, precluding any true remorse. Rigel spun away from the weapon and took a couple quick steps back to catch her breath. Antiope had blood dripping down her chin, but one wouldn't know it from the utterly focused look in her eyes. She spat a glob of red spit onto the platform, and Rigel couldn't help but think that no one should be so careless with their own blood. Antiope advanced with a vengeance, resuming her two-handed grip and casting with a speed that Rigel spent every ounce of focus keeping up with. Eventually, the girl was close enough to begin slashing at Rigel again, and without the option of a shield, Rigel met every blow with one or both of her gauntlets. Her arms began to shake with the sheer amount of force raining down on them, but she was maneuvering Antiope around the platform all the while. Finally, Rigel reached the position she needed. She flung a venture so powerful she could perceive the net change in her core, and it flung Antiope back and down, pressing her into the ground until it dissipated. With her opponent temporarily occupied, Rigel dropped into a crouch and dragged her fingers through the congealing wad of red spit that Antiope had abandoned. As she drew an abbreviated rune with the fresh blood on her fingers, she said, "Rigescant in dutai." Antiope, who had scarcely regained her feet, literally froze. The blood in her veins ceased just long enough for Rigel to lunge forward, wrap her gauntlet hand around the sword, and wrest the blade from Antiope's fingers. The effect of the single rune magic only lasted a brief moment, not nearly long enough to do the girl any real harm, but it was long enough for Rigel to drop the sword to the ground and cast a sticking charm with a truly vindictive sense of satisfaction. The first thing Antiope did was try to wandlessly summon the sword. It remained fixed to the stone, and the redhead girl shouted her fury to the sky. She charged, but Rigel thought the girl looked a lot less frightening with only a wand to brandish before her. Antiope's entire style depended on her weapon. Without it, her defense had glaring holes, and Rigel took advantage of each and every one. She kept the duel close, so that Antiope had neither time nor space to dodge. Antiope tried several debilitating spells, but without the sword to swing in their wake, Rigel was free to shield or dodge as she preferred. The redhead was good, but Rigel was faster. She whipped spell after spell into Antiope's defense, and after the sixth overpowered stunner, Antiope's magic faltered. Rigel saw the shield flicker, and when it failed, she had an incarcerous waiting. Antiope fell, bound and shortly thereafter disarmed, to the stone. Rigel stared at her opponent's wand, resting innocently in the palm on her free hand, and it took her a moment to realize it was over. Then she realized no one was cheering. Well, there you have it. Even Bagman seemed vaguely stunned. Black advances to the final round. The applause started slowly, and faded quickly. Rigel was amazed that she still had it in her to care, but something about the lackluster response to her victory set off warning bells in her brain. As the adrenaline receded and full reason returned, Rigel wondered belatedly if blood magic hadn't been the best way to endear the public to her cause. It's not as though it was a blood curse or anything permanent, she reasoned. The rune was one she'd found in Dumbledore's book, A Raise for the Harried, and she didn't believe the headmaster would give her anything dangerous. She released Antiope and returned her wand, all the while trying not to quail under the fiery fury in the shorter redhead's glare. What kind of dirty trick was that, Black? Rigel did not pretend to misunderstand her. I drew a rune in your blood, she said, indicating the smudge on the platform that remained. It wasn't shed willingly, but that doesn't mean it holds no power. Antiope scowled and pointed her wand at the smudge. Scourgify. Her expression was still furious, but there was a grudging understanding in her eyes, too, when she looked back at Rigel. "They don't teach us runes at Chelsea OEQs. Aside from the trick, you fought well. This wasn't your first time facing a weaponed duelist." Rigel smiled, but didn't respond to the implied question. The two of them made their way toward the stairs, but Bagman's voice forestalled their descent. "The three remaining champions will each duel one another for the final round. The matches will be Black and Crumb, Crumb and Owens, then Owens and Black." Rigel suppressed a groan as she realized she'd be dueling again immediately. Antiope gave her a smirk as she continued down the stairs. "The highest score will be given to either the competitor who wins both his matches or the one the judges deem to have fought most impressively overall." It didn't escape Rigel's notice that she was the only champion who would have to duel 4 times instead of 3. Why couldn't they give her a bye this round and let her duel the winner between Crumb and Owens? Riddle really was a sadist, she decided as she turned around and moved back to the center of one side of the platform. She tightened the laces on her boots, gave her muscles a quick stretch, and waited for Crumb to take the stage as well. Crumb regarded her warily as he took up a ready stance on the opposite side of the stage. Rigel dipped into a slight crouch and bent her mind to the upcoming duel. She'd seen from his match with Tariel that Crumb was a careful, strategic duelist. He was also well rested from his break, while her muscles ached from the battering of Antiope's sword. If she wanted a shot at outlasting him, Rigel would have to keep him at a distance and wear him down with magic. Grimly, she brandished her wand and waited for Bagman to count them in. 3, 2, 1. -0. TR. -0. The scene playing out on the platform below could not have gone better if he'd choreographed it himself. He supposed, in a way, he had, but Rigel Black had once again surpassed his every expectation. The boy was a diamond under pressure, each match he performed better, even as his competitors grew wan and worn. Originally, he'd not expected the Slytherin to actually win the third task. The boy need only advance to the final round, and his existing point lead would ensure that he was crowned the pureblood champion. The two girls he was matched against should not have posed a major challenge, at least, not if the judges had followed his advice against allowing Antiope a weapon. The promise of a more exciting spectacle had been too tempting for the Department of Magical Games and Sports to ignore, however, and he was forced to grit his teeth as Black dueled an opponent he was in no way qualified to face. Again, however, the boy had surprised him. Rather than fumble before the added challenge, as Delacour had, Rigel became more efficient. More creative. Pain seemed not to slow him, and nothing, neither the cheers nor jeers of the crowd above him, could break his concentration. Few wizards had any real experience with dueling these days, much less the skill to handle both wand and weapon simultaneously. It was why he'd expected the boy to leap at the chance for real training in the art. When Rigel rejected his offer in amused pride, he'd thought him wholly foolish. Now, he wasn't so sure. The boy looked utterly at his leisure, neither overly tense nor particularly nervous as he led the Durmstrang boy around the stage in a subtle dance. Crumb thought he was setting the pace, carefully probing his opponent's defenses with an unpredictable combination of grey magic that mixed dangerous spells with relatively innocuous ones. It was clear to him, however, that Rigel was only obliging the pace to recover energy after his last duel. Eventually, the boy would strike back. Rigel Black was more ruthless than he admitted, whether he realized it or not. He took a moment to observe those around him in the judges' box. Most of the occupants were utterly enthralled in the duel, impressed, as well they should be, in the level of talent the young wizards were displaying. There was one rather predictable exception. Albus Dumbledore's eyes were, as ever, leveled at Tom. He wondered whether the old headmaster suspected his final aim in all this. Probably he did, it mattered not. For once, Dumbledore was only tangentially related to his primary target. A dismayed gasp from Marchbanks brought his head back around sharply. Rigel had taken the edge of a slicing spell to the arm. The boy didn't slow, and Riddle's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. After several more spells were exchanged, Rigel failed to fully shield against a buffeting charm, and was knocked back several feet. Crumb began to cast in earnest, no doubt sensing victory on the horizon. Rigel took several other spells in some peripheral way or another, and then Riddle realized his game. The boy never flinched or even betrayed surprise when one of Crumb's spells caught him. Telling, too, was that none of the seriously damaging spells came anywhere close to him. He's letting them hit. Lulling Crumb into a false sense of security. Riddle had to smirk in heady approval. The boy was allowing Crumb to come to the conclusion that he was tired, slowing down and getting sloppy. It was gloriously satisfying to watch the Durmstrang champion advance, like a particularly bold lamb to the slaughter. His sharp peripheral vision surprised a troubled frown on Dumbledore's face. Tom slowly turned to acknowledge the ancient wizard, unable to hide his amusement at Dumbledore's distress. So he was worried for his precious student, was he? Rigel Black would not be the first soul Dumbledore failed to save, nor would he be the last. Another sharp sound from Marchbanks, whose objectivity was but a fragile screen when it came to the young Slytherin dueling below, brought his attention back to the entertainment. Crumb had attempted to press his advantage. He was nearing the center of the platform, risking the added vulnerability of the position under the assumption that Rigel was losing steam. Rigel allowed himself to be thrown backwards and rolled, seeming to miss the next two spells almost by sheer luck alone. Crumb darted forward, but by the time the fourth spell left his wand, Rigel was on his feet again, sprinting toward the surprised Bulgarian boy with no sign of the fatigue he'd been feigning just moments before. Crumb was thrown on the defensive as his opponent closed the gap between them, forced to hold a shield against the barrage of spells the slighter boy threw his way, scrambling backwards all the while. Faster and faster the boy cast, continuing to advance until there was nowhere left for Crumb to retreat within the wards. The stadium around them was almost silent as Rigel threw magic across the stage as if it was effortless. It seemed impossible that the young wizard could produce magic any faster, and yet, within the space of one breath to the next, he did. The entire platform was lit with the ferocity of the boy's casting, each spell taking off on wings of light before the one before it had been dispersed. He doubted any shield, no matter how expertly cast, could hold against it for long. Crumb was utterly overwhelmed. It was gratifying to see the boy perform so well, even as his talent made attempting to mentor him inconvenient. The more Rigel Black succeeded, the harder he would be to control. And yet, his very plans depended on the boy rising higher than he ever dreamed. If only the child would not resist his destiny. He could feel nothing but pure pleasure watching Rigel force his opponent to submit. Cunning. Patient. Ruthless. Was the boy not a perfect conduit for his knowledge and influence? Even his stubbornness would be an asset, when turned in the proper direction. As Bagman proclaimed Rigel's victory, he listened to the crowd's uneasy rumblings. As the boy lifted his head uncertainly to the sky, he saw the trepidation in his eyes. He smiled slowly. This, he could work with. Often he bestowed on his followers validation where otherwise in their lives it was absent. Rigel Black would be set apart after this demonstration. Envied. Feared. Suspected of anything the shallow minds of the masses could conceive. The boy knew it, by the uneasy way he ducked his head and allowed the medics on standby to escort him to the healing tent. Tom caught Dumbledore's eyes as he made his way from the box. The icy gaze levied a heavy judgment, but he was no longer a child. He had no interest in the following match, and took his time descending the many steps to the ground level. By the time he stepped into the healing tent, Rigel's wounds, minor as they were, had all been treated. The healers left the tent quietly as he entered, and he turned his attention to his quarry. The boy sat on a cot with his head down, a cup clutched between his hands. The water in the cup trembled, and when he spoke, it sloshed over the edge. "Congratulations, Rigel." The boy lifted his head with a gasp that was only audible to his superb hearing. "Riddle." His voice was flat, but resigned rather than combative. "What a spectacular set of duels you've had," he went on. "It's easy to see that you're the most impressive competitor on that stage." Sure enough, the boy's eyes flickered up toward the roaring crowd and back down unconsciously. Rigel grimaced. "I'm winning, at least," he said, shrugging uncomfortably. He shook his head slowly. "And yet you sound guilty for doing so." Rigel scowled, but before an argument could surface, he'd pressed on. "Their applause means nothing, you know." The boy gaped at him in surprise. He smiled down at him ruefully. "There will always be those who are envious of true ability and trepidatious of its implications. He carefully did not mention the word power. The boy had responded poorly to it in the past. Of course they try to make less of you. They would rather see you as other than as something they could all aspire to if they ever bothered to truly apply themselves. Rigel's eyes were wide, and he stared at Tom as though he'd never seen him before. He took a small step closer and lowered his chin slightly, just enough to convey a sense of empathetic rapport. They don't see the hours of training, the late nights spent in fervent study, or the early mornings of disciplined practice. They don't see weekends and holidays sacrificed to self-betterment, but I see those things. I see your ambition, your perseverance, and your drive. You are extraordinary, and you shall not apologize for it in my presence. He lowered his voice, softening it deftly. Anyone who doesn't realize that is in the wrong. Well done today. You've shown the world what you're truly capable of. Rigel looked more lost than accepting of the words, but that was all right for now. He turned to go, and thought the boy didn't mean his muttered, "That's what I'm afraid of," to be heard by him. He did not acknowledge it, except in his head. One day, Rigel Black, you will not be afraid of anything. When you stand at my side, fear will be but a memory of a time before uncompromising greatness was fully embraced. -0. HP. -0. As Riddle walked out of the tent, Rigel had to admit that, if she hadn't been a half-blood pretending to be a pure-blood, and if she hadn't known he was full of shite, she might actually find him convincing. There were times, she conceded, when the man was incredibly persuasive. She could hardly blame people for being swayed by him. Somehow, in some sick twist of the fabric of time and space, Riddle had known exactly what she longed to hear in that moment, when doubt and unease churned their way to dread in her stomach. It was precisely that which made her distrust the man, though. Friends did not come to you when you were at your most vulnerable and attempt to sway you. If the man had known the first thing about true friendship or even mentorship, he would know better than to try to use her weakness to leverage her viewpoint toward his own. She sighed. Riddle's little pep talk aside, she still had one last duel before the day was done. The look in Crumb's eyes as she'd pinned him in place and ripped away the last of his defenses was something she'd never forget. The Bulgarian had looked at her as though she'd peeled off her own face before his eyes. Shock, disbelief, fear, and panic all shot across the state boy's face in the instant he realized how badly he'd underestimated her. Now they would all know that beneath Rigel's calm, collected demeanor there was something undeniably aggressive. Something merciless. Knowing that staying in the tent wouldn't help her analyze ONs for her upcoming match, Rigel levered herself up from the cot and left the healing tent behind to seek out the stairs up to the champion's box. She was the only one left, so she let her shoulders slump and leaned heavily on the railing, taking in the match below with tired eyes. It was clear almost immediately that Crumb had exhausted himself in his match against her. He spent more time dodging than casting, and when he did cast the spells flew sluggishly. The boy's magical core was just about tapped from all the powerful spells he'd thrown her way. Owens was faring much better, likely because this was only his second duel, not his third, and he conserved a lot of energy with his shield flickering technique. Owens' footwork was fluid, and he seemed to slide effortless out of the way of Crumb's ranged attacks. Whenever the Bulgarian attempted to close the distance between them, Owens switched his spells to area effect charms and transfigurations to keep him back. It was clever, Rigel admitted, watching Crumb once again fall back before a barrage of sharp stones banished his way. Crumb's already weakened magic would be even more ineffectual at a distance, easy to dodge and somewhat attenuated by the long way the spells had to travel. The match didn't last much longer. Without the strength to conjure any of his own area effect spells, Crumb was at an unrecoverable disadvantage. When Owens caught the boy in a petrification charm at last, Rigel made her way down from the box with a thoughtful frown. Getting through Owens' defense was going to be a challenge. She passed an exhausted, bruised, and scowling Crumb on the way up to the platform. "You fought well," she offered. He paused to let her by, shaking his head. "I lost the pure blood spot when you beat me," he said. "I just wanted to pay that boy back for what he did to me one." Crumb leveled an imploring look at her. "Thrash him, Black." Rigel pressed her lips together but nodded slowly. She didn't like the dark desire for vengeance that thrummed in her blood, but she also couldn't forget the sound of Hermione's ribs cracking beneath an entirely unnecessary fly pendo. Owens was waiting patiently for her as she ascended the final steps. He smiled, and there was an unruffled quality to the tall boy that didn't sit right with her. Rigel wondered why she hadn't paid closer attention to the boy during the first two tasks. With so many competitors on the field, many of them boasting unique and exotic abilities, it was too easy to overlook the blonde American. She should have listened to Pansy and Millicent. She couldn't for the life of her remember anything specific about his background. It should have been a red flag that the innocuous-looking boy across from her was leading the scoreboard. Before, Rigel had been too focused on her own concerns to really see this boy, but she was looking at him now. The boy bowed with a mocking grin as Bagman counted down to the last match. Rigel solemnly returned the bow. If he was going to invoke the courtesies, then she wouldn't be the one to disgrace them. As the final word rang out, Rigel's wand arched into motion. Two stunners and a disarming spell cast so fast there was scarcely space between them were enough to wipe the smile off the Ilvermorny boy's face, but his micro-shield flickered up to intercept each attack. She had to admit his timing was impeccable. Not many could judge the speed of a spell's approach accurately enough to confidently raise and lower a shield at precisely the right moment. It meant he never spent much time passive, easily moving between defense and offense with seamless speed. Every time Rigel tried to close the distance between them, Owens repeated his strategy for keeping Crumb at arm's length, area effect spells nasty enough to deter most people from bearing the brunt of them. She allowed him to force her retreat with wind charms, fire spells, and blasting curses. Just as she could see him begin to relax into the rhythm, she charged. Startled, Owens conjured a barrage of icy shards and banished them toward her in a razor-sharp rain. Rigel shielded without stopping and didn't let up her sprint. Owens jerked his wand down and the ice instead began to solidify beneath her feet. Rigel leapt forward over the ice and tucked into a ball, maintaining her shield tightly around her and letting it roll her forward in a dizzying tumble. The roll carried her forward so fast, even Owens couldn't get another spell up before she was in his guard. Rigel's left hand clamped down on his wand arm, jerking the weapon away from her with brute force. Owens let out a grunt of surprise but reacted quickly. His free hand grabbed wildly at her head, gripping a fistful of hair and yanking it down harshly. Rather than let him leverage his strength to pull her off him, Rigel inverted her wand and severed the hair with a wordless charm. Owens' wide eyes were riveted on her wand, waiting for it to turn around and curse him, but he was looking in the wrong direction entirely. Her left hand hadn't been idle. The runeless fire array she'd imprinted in pure magic on his sleeve ignited, and the taller boy let out a strangled howl of pain. Rigel had let go of his arm before the array activated, and the boy was free to drop to the platform and roll in an instinctive attempt to put the fire out. Maybe she could have disarmed him right then in his distraction, but she didn't. Later, she could tell herself that she'd been playing it safe, hesitating to avoid overextending herself, but in that moment, she simply wasn't done with Jacob Owens. As he rolled, she crouched to the stone and drew a ground-shaking array with her wand. It ripped up the stage in a circle around her, bucking Owens' rolling form with the force of the magic she'd shoved into it. He hit his head on the stone but managed to raise a shield as he rolled to a stop, not one of his flickeringly short varieties, but a real shield, carefully layered and intended to last. No doubt he would try to hold it until he could regain his feet. Rigel cast a lightning jaw at the shield almost idly, and the magic collapsed in on itself with a shudder. Owens cursed, only half risen, and stumbled backwards away from the blasting curse that followed. As she pursued the boy around the platform, Rigel reflected that it was for the best that theirs was the last match. The stage wouldn't be in much condition for anyone after she was through with it. The next several minutes were an exercise in sheer stamina for Rigel, and a prolonged, desperate escape attempt for Owens. The more disheveled the boy became, the more satisfied Rigel felt. By the time the boy found himself leaning, panting and sweating, against the wards, the stage was a lunarscape of potholes and crevices, interspersed with the occasional scorch mark. Rigel was beginning to tire too, however, and knew that only an end to the match would bring her real peace. She tossed a couple of standard disarming spell at him and let Owens shield as usual, his signature defense flickering up and away again with the same precision it had at the beginning of the duel. Then, Rigel cast a stunning spell with her wand and followed it immediately with a wandless banishing charm, cast from her left hand without moving it from her side. The second, nearly invisible spell caught up to the first about 2/3 of the way across the space between her and Owens. The boy, clearly familiar with the speed at which a standard stunner moved, defended automatically. This time, however, his timing was just the tiniest bit off. Rigel's accelerated spell reached him before his shield was fully formed, and he collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. It was a long moment before Rigel lowered her wand and let out her breath in a slow whoosh. Her ears were ringing with the noise in the stadium, but for the life of her she couldn't tell whether it was approval or not. She supposed it didn't matter. She'd won. The energy which had sustained her for most of the day began to drain out of her like the air coming out of a balloon when the hand holding it closed had let go at last. She considered reviving Owens, but there were already healers coming onto the stage to do just that. Instead, Rigel tucked her wand away and began her final descent from the dueling platform. A healer approached her as she crossed the lawn, but she waved the wizard off. There was nothing wrong with her that he could fix. Bagman was shouting something to the crowd, but she wasn't listening. All her energy was bent toward putting one foot in front of the other. Pansy and Draco, somehow, got to her before she reached the exit. They must have left their seats the moment Owens collapsed. She attempted a smile for them, but it withered on the vine. She felt like a rag that had been wrung out and left to hang limply on a line. Already, she regretted losing her temper with Owens. Why had she let the stupid tournament get to her? Congratulations, Rigel Draco said earnestly. You did it. You're the pureblood champion. The pureblood champion. She, Harriet Potter, was the pureblood champion. A hollow laugh escaped her, and she clamped her hand to her mouth to hold it in. Her shoulders shook with the effort. I'm the pureblood champion. Even her mental voice sounded hysterical. What a joke. The laughter turned to hiccuping sobs, and Pansy gathered her close in a gentle embrace. It's all right, Rigel. It's over, now. Let it out. It wasn't over, though. At best, she was only halfway through the storm of madness. She turned her face into Pansy's shoulders and listened to the girl tut over her newly shorn hair. Somehow, the inane concern centered her, and she calmed as Pansy prattled on about the charms it would take to fix the uneven length. He looks dangerous, Draco argued. We should shave it all instead. Rigel choked out a laugh, imagining Archie's face if she told him he needed to go bald for the winter holidays. When she leaned back to send Draco a grateful smile, he smiled back bracingly. Seriously, you were great, right? He waggled a finger at her and added, I think you've been holding back in dueling club. The joke fell flat, and Rigel knew by the slightly awed look in his eyes that she'd really surprised him that day. Beneath his concern for her and his unquestioning support, Draco must be wondering how kind, studious Rigel Black could put someone on their back like that. She'd never gone so far in training. She turned away from his conflicted gaze and took a deep breath. Forcing a nonchalant grin, she said, I guess you never brought out my full potential. Maybe Pansy should take over the. But then it would be the Pa, Draco complained. The Pansy Association just sounds sad. How about the perfect army? Pansy suggested lightly. She tucked her arm through Rigel's and began to tow her slowly toward the exit, studiously ignoring the churning crowd that stood between them and the castle doors. More like the pathetic army. They bickered over the options all the way back to the Slytherin common room, and somehow the normalcy of their banter cut through the awestruck faces and the whispers when no amount of stoic pride or quiet humility would have protected her. By the time she reached her dorm, she had almost stilled the quivering anxiety in her chest. Whatever conclusions her friends may have drawn from her performance in the third task, they were sticking by her. It was that thought that Rigel clutched tightly to as she locked herself in the bathroom and turned the water as hot as it would go. As the water washed away all evidence of the day, she told herself that Riddle was wrong. Power didn't count for everything, and not everyone who witnessed it would inevitably flinch away from it. It just confirmed her suspicion that the politician had no real friends. From that thought came another, far more disturbing. How different might the world be if he did? -0. HP. -0. Rigel woke the next morning with a vague idea of spending the day in her lab. She deserved some relaxation after the third task, she thought, and her walk to the Great Hall for breakfast was occupied imagining which potion she would brew first. She veered toward the Slytherin table, but was waylaid as she passed the Gryffindors by a pair of highly complimentary redheads. "Puppy. You were a right terrier yesterday. Didn't stick around to let anyone congratulate you though," George added, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Don't you know your adoring fans need face time to sustain their obsession?" "More reason to remain scarce," Rigel said. "No chance of that today," Fred said, chuckling. She frowned, looking between the two sixth years suspiciously. "Why's that? I hope you haven't done anything extravagant." The twins stared at her. George coughed and said, "It's, the Yule Ball tonight, Rigel." His voice climbed higher as he added, "You do have a date, right?" Rigel rolled her eyes on a groan. "I forgot about that." "Forgot?" Fred laughed. "You're only the main even, pup. Listen, if you need a date, I'm sure we can." "No need for that." The three of them turned to see Matthew Sousa with a relaxed half-smile on his face. She searched his expression critically, but his eyes seemed clear for the moment. The Brazilian boy leaned down and said, voice light, "I will take you, if you like." It took her an embarrassingly long moment to realize he was asking her to the Yule Ball. Her eyes widened and she shook her head apologetically. "That's very kind. I have my fiancé is coming. But thank you." "Sorry." Matthews tilted his head consideringly at her, but then he sighed dramatically. "I will never heal from this hurt. My life is now pale and black." Rigel frowned. "It can't be both pale and black." "Ouch, so harsh, puppy." Fred snickered. "Give the bloke a chance," George added, smirking down at her superiorly. She glared up at them. "Why don't one of you give him a chance, then, if you feel so bad?" She turned to Matthews with a sweet smile. "Fred and George are excellent company. You should ask one of them." The twins exchanged an affronted look. "One of us? Impossible. We're a set, puppy." She was certain they were joking, but Matthews smiled widely and spread his arms. "Will you two do me this honor, then?" Fred and George had matching expressions of mischief. "I'm imagining Mum's face," Fred admitted, grinning widely. "And it's difficult to resist," George agreed, nodding in false solemnity. He eyed Matthews with sudden suspicion. "Say, we weren't your second choice, were we?" Matthews widened his eyes with affected dismay. "Pray, do not imagine this. In truth, Rigel was but an excuse to talk to you." "In that case, however could we refuse?" Fred wrapped his arms around George's neck and batted his eyes at Matthews playfully. "Be gentle with us." Rigel looked between the twins and Matthews, confusion warring with horror as she imagined the three of them unleashed on the world. A thought struck her and she narrowed her eyes at the twins. "Don't drink anything he gives you," she said flatly. A moment later, she reconsidered and shot a worried look toward the Brazilian boy. "Don't drink anything they give you, actually." All three of the boys laughed, and Rigel firmly told herself that it was not her fault if Hogwarts was a smoking ruin by the end of the night. She turned resolutely away, thinking that if the world was to end in a matter of hours, she at least wanted to eat breakfast first. As she sat, Blaise said, "Bit early to be breaking hearts, isn't it, Rigel?" She shot him a look that said she did not appreciate him using his enhanced hearing to eavesdrop. "The castle has gone mad," she muttered, spooning porridge into her bowl. "One night of madness never hurt anyone," Pansy said, smiling slyly. Rigel gave her an unimpressed look. "What hapless soul are you taking, then?" she asked. Pansy sniffed, but there was something more nervous than haughty about it. "Draco is accompanying me, actually." Her eyes met Rigel's briefly before turning to study her orange juice with undue gravity. "As friends, of course." "That's great," Rigel said at once. There was an awkward pause before Pansy said, "Yes, well. Blaise is escorting Miss Abbott, of course. Theo has managed to catch Smith's eye, and Millie is taking Mr. Zahai." Millicent flushed, the color dramatic against her pale skin. "He's interesting." Pansy nodded sagely. "He is, indeed. I think it's quite decorous of you to be such a faultless ambassador for Hogwarts, Millie." The visitors are in an awkward position, attempting to secure escorts in a foreign place. Not all of them did, though Theo pointed out. "That Chinese girl brought a bow from home, I hear, and the American Rigel trashed in the finals did, too. Rigel winced. It hadn't been that bad, had it? Delacour is going with Roger Davies, of all people, Draco put in. Can you imagine that twit attempting a waltz? Rigel did a quick mental tally and said, what about Antiope? She was the only one, besides Crumb and Hermione, they hadn't mentioned. Pansy smiled slowly. Miss Weasley asked her. I was there when it happened. She said that stunning redheads such as themselves could only logically deign to accompany one another, and Antiope agreed. Rigel could easily imagine Ginny saying such a thing, and she had to smile in amusement. Picturing the two fiery, bold souls, she thought the combination would either be spectacular or disastrous. Weasley just wanted to be the only third year to attend the ball, Draco said cynically. Then she succeeded, and we can't fault her for that, Pansy said primly. Rigel thought privately that people faulted others for succeeding all the time, but she didn't say so. She made it halfway through breakfast without thinking about anything other than how many cauldrons she could reasonably expect to brew simultaneously that morning. She was a little rusty at juggling multiple brews, but the challenge would be refreshing. The mail brought ripples of surprised exclamations and murmured conversations. Rigel, despite her better judgment, turned her attention to the paper that Pansy was poring over with Millicent and said, "What is it, Pan?" Her friend had a familiar, uneasy look on her face. "It's the marriage law." Her heart dropped. "It's passed already." Pansy shook her head quickly. "No, but it passed committee last night." Rigel was not at all familiar with legislative processes, but Millicent clarified at the frown on her face. "The bill was introduced for consideration and has passed the preliminary requirements for being voted on by the full Wizengamot at a future point." "When will they vote on it?" she asked weakly. "Not for a while," Millicent said, shrugging. "The Wizengamot is in recess through the holidays, and typically only sit about 60 days a year. With the number of propositions already on the docket for the spring session, I'd estimate it'll be at least after the spring break before it's considered." She felt the ice in her veins thaw in slow relief. She still had time. To do what, she wasn't sure. All she knew was that there must be some way she could influence the outcome. If not, then all the time spent preparing for and stressing over the tournament would be an utter waste. After a moment in which her blood pressure attempted to convince her to just pack up and move to Mallorca, Rigel took a deep breath and turned back to her breakfast. There was no need to be macabre over breakfast. Rather, she should turn her mind to something more productive. How exactly Archie was going to get to Hogwarts, for instance. -0. HP. -0. Professor Snape had already made the arrangements, it turned out. Archie would be arriving in her head of house's office by special international flu access a short while before the ball was set to start, and Rigel had to wonder just how focused on the third task she'd been that she could hardly remember the conversation she'd had with Snape several days before outlining precisely that. Pansy, bless her patient heart, had graciously found the time to select Rigel's dress robes amidst her own preparations, and so it was with tentative confidence in her attire that she arrived at Master Snape's office door. She pulled at the stiff collar awkwardly as she knocked. When the door opened, she was entirely surprised to find her professor also dressed in formal robes, his hair clubbed back neatly and his expression no less severe for the transformation. It made obvious sense, she supposed. It was a formal event for all attending, not only the champions, and that included teachers, too. She stepped into the room to wait and tried not to scuff the shiny toes of her entirely unfunctional shoes as she walked. Archie was right on time, and both she and Snape moved out of the way as the temporarily connected fireplace lit up in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Her cousin spun out of the grate with a graceful stride, his delicate, sky-blue dress robes swirling around slender legs. There was an odd gait to his approach, and Rigel realized with raised eyebrows that Archie was wearing improbably constructed heels of sparkling silver. Her eyes trailed up the form-fitting tailoring about his hips and waist, and she nearly choked when she noticed the cheerfully bouncing twin globes affixed to her cousin's chest, scarcely contained by the thin, draping material that gathered almost in afterthought around Archie's lithe neck. What on Merlin's green earth? Rigel did not return her cousin's stunning smile. Her face looked absurdly incongruous atop the menacingly curvaceous form she could only assume Archie had constructed solely on the basis of a Play Wizard magazine. Cousin. Archie wrapped graceful arms around her. I've missed you so. Rigel forced her arms to hug the alien being clinging to her, but dropped them immediately in distaste. Archie felt so wrong as a female. Harry, so glad you could make it safely. Thanks for coming all this way. Archie shrugged, patting his elaborate updo as he pulled back from their embrace. Term is over anyway for us. Easier to flew here and go home with you and Sirius tonight than to catch a flight from the States. Master Snape, you look fantastic, Archie added airily. Thanks so much for setting up the international flu tonight. Snape's face was entirely blank as he said, perhaps you and your guest should make your way toward the Great Hall, Rigel. She nodded, taking Archie by the wrist and saying, good idea, Professor. See you in a bit. When they were safely in the corridor, she whirled on Archie and demanded in a strident whisper, what is wrong with you? Archie blinked at her in surprise. What? She jabbed a finger in the general direction of Archie's metamorphized chest and hips. That. Why didn't you stick to something more androgynous? In this dress. Archie looked down skeptically at the clinging fabric. It would never have worked. Who told you to pick such a revealing dress? She hissed. Could he honestly not see any problem with his appearance? How am I supposed to look like that for the rest of the holidays after Sirius sees you tonight? Sorlaser, how am I supposed to replicate that for the rest of my life? A sheepish look dawned across her cousin's face. Ah, I see. Well, the clothes you wear are usually so baggy. Who's to say what size rack you have? I bet Sirius will assume he just never noticed. If he notices at all, I mean, he's your uncle. He'd have to be blind not to notice those. Trim them down. Now. Archie pouted at her, the red lipstick on his mouth making the expression more dramatic. Then it won't fit right. I'll shrink your dress a little, Rigel said through gritted teeth. Snape's already seen me. I swear on your life Professor Snape will not ask. The boy in female flesh sighed, but obligingly went down a cup size. It was still overwhelmingly wrong in every way, but at least Harry no longer looked like an underwear model. When Archie's dress was appropriately adjusted to his satisfaction, they started toward the Great Hall again. He peeked over at her under dark mascara. Are you still angry with me? Rigel sighed. No. Sorry, Harry. I've been sort of stressed lately. I know. Archie smiled ruefully at her. I heard you won the third task. She immediately felt guilty for having forgotten to tell him so herself. Yes. Sorry, cause. I should have used the mirror to tell you. I get it, Rigel. Really. You've got a lot on your shoulders right now. I think you're doing great, though. Halfway through, right? She nodded wearily. I can't wait to go home tonight. I need to get out of this mess for a bit. Just a few more hours, her cousin said, patting her on the back consolingly. His expression was poised and, if she admitted it, his version of her face was quite pretty, all done up in makeup, glittering drops in his ears. It doesn't look like me, though, she thought uneasily. Then she shook her head and impatiently reminded herself that she didn't even know what she looked like anymore. What did it really matter what Archie did with her face? It wasn't as though she hadn't ever caused him difficulties wearing his face the last few years. They reached the entrance hall and found the other champions waiting to the side of the Great Hall doors with their respective dates. Hermione waved shyly at them from her place next to Crumb, but her welcoming expression faltered as she caught sight of Archie in full female get-up. Hi Harry, she said. After a moment of awkward hesitancy, she stepped forward to embrace her friend warmly. I've missed you, she added, her brown eyes searching Archie's. Whatever she found there, it softened her smile and relaxed the tenseness in her shoulders. Letters just aren't the same, are they? Archie's eyes swept Hermione with bright appreciation. Not at all the same. Look at you, Mion. You look like a fairy tale come to life. Hermione flushed and giggled embarrassedly. I spent ages getting ready. I felt such a ninny in front of the mirror, but, well, it's not every day you get to attend a party like this. Rigel realized that the Yule Ball, which had seemed like just another stiflingly elitist event to her, would be the first time Hermione had any real exposure to pure-blood high society. She hoped the girl wasn't expecting a true fairy tale. There were more thorns than roses to be found on a night like this, in her experience. Then again, perhaps Rigel was just cynical. There was no reason Hermione couldn't have a wonderful time, dancing and drinking and reveling in the sparkling beauty around her without ever looking too closely at the sins it concealed. Merlin, I sound like Rosier now. Rigel cast her eyes about for something else to focus on and found Krum hovering awkwardly where Hermione had left him. She smiled bracingly at him, knowing the Bulgarian boy had no idea what sort of undercurrents were being exchanged between his date and her friend from America. Taking pity on the situation, Rigel introduced Krum to Archie before Hermione had to present him as her date. Have you met Victor Krum, Harry? He's one of the other tournament champions, she said. Krum, this is my cousin, Harriet Potter. Harry was nice enough to come all the way from America to be here tonight. Archie's eyes left Hermione reluctantly and settled on the Bulgarian boy with careful blankness. Nice to meet you. Shame you didn't make it to the finals. Krum grimaced, but politely responded. Your cousin was the better wizard. I wish you luck in the next tasks, Black. She thanked him, and it was a mercifully short wait that followed before McGonagall began to usher the champions into the hall. As Krum and Hermione pulled ahead of them, Rigel whispered, "Can you dance in those shoes?" to her unusually quiet cousin. Startled from whatever internal reverie he'd been lost in, Archie blinked at her. Dance. Yes, dance. We have to dance now, she said. You hate to dance, he reminded her. I was not given the option of refusing, Rigel said, frowning. So is that a yes or? Mr. Black. Wait here until Mr. Krum and Miss Granger pass through the doors, then proceed. McGonagall barely glanced at them as she focused on the timing of their entrance. When the first dance concludes, you will be called to the small platform in the center to be officially announced as a finalist. Go now, Mr. Black. They were the last through the doors, and she felt the air catch momentarily in her lungs at the sight of the great hall done up in all its festive splendor. She wondered whether the castle was always this beautiful during the holidays, but reasoned that whatever the usual standard was, an event such as the Yule Ball would no doubt have raised the bar higher. The floating candles had been replaced with shining balls of soft light that danced to their own soundless tune above their heads. Great wreaths sat proudly in a river of thick garland, anointed by the same golden frost that coated the sills of every window. A dozen towering trees broke up the otherwise cavernous hall, each one decorated more spectacularly than the last, and in the center of them all was a large open space clearly intended for dancing. A full orchestra was stationed where the head table usually sat, and a long table of refreshments lined the left side of the hall. The dance floor already held 6 couples and 1 triad, and as soon as Rigel and Archie took up their spot, the music began. She and Archie both stepped the same direction, then froze. Archie's eyes widened comically. I don't know how to follow, he blurted. Rigel felt a smile tug at her lips. Neither do I. They both laughed quietly, and Archie shrugged. Let's just make it up. They began again, Rigel moving so painfully slowly that Archie at least had a chance to mirror her steps before she stepped again. She tried to apply the correct pressure to his waist and hand, to cue him as to her intentions before each step, but Archie was comically incapable of processing her signals in time to meet her movements with his own. They fumbled about in a largely stationary circle, while other champions gracefully danced around them in their procession across the floor. She met Archie's eyes again and couldn't stop the laugh that bubbled up from her stomach. This is ridiculous, she said. Still, there was a large grin on her face. When was the last time she'd really smiled about anything? There was a lightness in her heart that hadn't been there for some time. She didn't even mind the pitying glances Delacour and Davies shot them as they twirled by. The twins, who had formed a loose sort of triangle formation with Matthews, joined hands and lifted them over Rigel and Archie's heads in a bridge as they passed to either side. Archie pretended to cling to Rigel in swooning terror and she laughed again. Finally, the music swam to a lingering halt and Rigel let go of her cousin to bow. Archie tried to bow too, forgetting that a dipping curtsy would make more sense in his robes, and they bumped heads. You are the worst date ever, Archie said, rubbing his temple. Me. Rigel snorted. You're all over the place, Harry. But you love me that way, darling. Archie lifted his nose. Shouldn't you be over there, anyway? Rigel looked to see Delacour and Owens both moving toward the very center of the dance floor, where a small platform was raised above the rest of the room. Riddle stood atop it in grand, silver-trimmed robes of evergreen. Rigel sighed, but comforted herself that after this, she would be free of champion duties for the whole winter break. She shot Archie a look before she left and said, "Don't wander off." He gave a simpering finger wave and smiled through closed lips. Praying he didn't cause any trouble without her there to stop him, Rigel moved to the raised platform and waited for the other two to ascend the short staircase first before she stepped up after them. From her vantage point, she had just enough height to see over the tops of every head in the hall. Delacour moved sideways to give her room to stand, her short, moon-white dress glinting in the soft light, and a hush fell over the crowd. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our little celebration," Riddle said. He did not seem to shout, but something amplified his voice clearly throughout the room in a way that was exponentially more pleasant than the usual sonorous charm. "As of yesterday, the new Triwizard Tournament is halfway concluded, and tonight we crown our blood representatives." Thunderous applause echoed up to the rafters, and Riddle paused a moment before beckoning Owens forward to the edge of the platform. First, the Muggle-born champion. Jacob Owens attained the highest overall score after the first two tasks, and in the duels he progressed further than any other Muggle-born competitor. "Congratulations, Mr. Owens. Is there anything you'd like to say?" Owens had a broad smile on his face as he raised a hand in acknowledgement of the polite applause. "Thank you, Lord Riddle. All I can say is that I'm deeply honored to have made it this far, and I look forward to being able to test my mettle against serious competitors going forward." Rigel's eyebrows came down in a frown at his words. What was that supposed to mean? That he didn't consider the other champions to be true competition? Delacour was presented next as the half-blood champion, and Riddle explained that although she earned no points in the third round, her scores from the first two were high enough that Antiope, who had earned 20 points for winning her first match but subsequently lost the second, was unable to surpass her. The French girl smiled prettily at the assembly and gave a short speech expressing her renewed determination going forward and the glory and honor she wished to win for Bose Batons. Then Riddle turned to Rigel, a truly patronizing smile on his face. "Finally, our pure-blood champion. Rigel Black. What can one say about this young man? Mr. Black demonstrated remarkable talent, rising to the top against incredible odds in the first two tasks and going on to defeat not two, nor even three, but four opponents in the final task. I think it's safe to say that he's the undisputed winner of the preliminary round." Applause broke out all around them, and Rigel had to fight the urge to scowl at Riddle for singling her out of an already singular group. "Mr. Black, if you please." Riddle's expectant expression told her it was not a request, and she stepped forward into the range of his amplification spell. She looked at all the upturned faces, wondering what she could say that would mean anything at all to them. "Good evening. I'd like to first thank all the people who have supported me since this tournament began. I don't think I would be standing here without you." She gazed thoughtfully at the cheerful, entertained expressions below her. "It must seem very exciting, watching us all run and jump and bleed and fall, then get back up to do it all over again. I can't imagine what it's looked like, but I can tell you what it's felt like. These tasks are unlike anything the average person would face in a lifetime, much less just a few short months. I feel more as though I survived something than won anything." To the champions whose scores, determined by whatever arbitrary metric, didn't merit a place in the finals, I'd just like to say, congratulations. You survived it too, with grace and heart both, and I think that's all anyone could ask of us. Thank you." She met Riddle's eyes with a defiant expression, but he didn't appear overly displeased at her subversive speech. Rather he bowed his head to her and said, "Thank you, Mr. Black, for reminding us all what an arduous journey it's been so far. Truly the young witch and wizards here before you have accomplished a Herculean task already. What awaits them in the new year, well, you'll just have to wait and see, won't you?" Amused titters rippled through the hall, and like that, the solemn spell was broken, and any small amount of shame Rigel's words might have stirred settled back beneath the blanket of cheap delight. As a reminder, for making it to the finals each of our 3 blood representatives will receive an additional 1,000 galleons and a full scholarship to the secondary institute of their choice. Rigel had actually forgotten about the prizes, and she wondered which secondary program Archie would want to go to. Riddle waited for the cheering to fade before continuing. And of course, whoever is crowned blood champion will be going on an all-expense-paid world tour next summer, in addition to becoming the new owner of this rare and powerful magical focus, the Rod of Zoil. Riddle seemed to draw the silver staff out of the very air, and he held it high so that the light-catching red stone cradled on top could be seen by all. The splitting headache that attacked her had Rigel stiffening in pained surprise. Her ears roared and Dom's voice drifted through the white noise. Just a little closer. Without realizing she was doing it, Rigel stepped forward. The pain receded and she cast out her magical awareness toward the staff, wondering what about it had got Dom so riled so quickly. It didn't feel powerful, exactly. There was no intense concentration of magic in the stone and it didn't seem to be exuding any sort of power into the air around it. There was something there, though, other than a pretty red stone. Something soft, dark, and slow-moving. She bent her focus toward the jewel with a frown, certain that there was more beneath the shadow feeling at the surface. She felt a creeping sensation in her mind, the likes of which she had not experienced since she was 11. Rigel flinched backwards, breath stuck in her throat, and she rooted her feet in place while leaping inward to her mindscape. She'd only just manifested on the mountainside when she heard Dom yelling, "Get back, you fool! I can handle Zoil's crawling mist." Rigel caught a glimpse of inky black fingers pressing through the storm at the edges of her mindscape, but a hand on her arm snapped her back to reality, where Delacour was tugging her surreptitiously toward the platform stairs. Riddle's eyes asked a question as she turned to descend, but Rigel ignored him. She was in the midst of a terrifying discovery and had no extraneous mental energy to spend. Delacour hissed at her to hurry, but Rigel barely had the faculties to stumble down to the dance floor at her own pace. Her head was aching, her hands shaking, and she very much wanted to hurl at the idea of that stuff invading her head. Never again, she snarled in her mind, and only Dom's answering, "I've got this," kept her from sitting down right there on the floor and sinking into a meditative state without care for where she was or how it would look. She kept her occlumency shield strong, aware of the parasite's tendency to jump into unguarded minds nearby, and pushed her way unseeing through the crowd. Rigel was vaguely aware of people calling out to congratulate her as she passed, but she didn't answer them. She made her way to a corner of the hall, skirting around one of the large trees to the backside of it, where she found a small space. The tree blocked the view of the rest of the hall. With space to breathe and think, Rigel turned her mind to the wonder, the horror, of the realization that the Rod of Zoil was a great big ball of sleeping sickness. Had Riddle infected it? To what purpose? She replayed Dom's reaction in her mind and let go of the first suspicion. If Dom was familiar with what he called Zoil's crawling mist, then it couldn't have been a recent change to the rod's nature. What if the Rod of Zoil was the original source of the sleeping sickness? She didn't know how long Riddle had been in possession of the staff, but there was a less than 0% chance that he'd had it long enough to learn to weaponize its characteristics. She could tell the exact moment when Dom succeeded in eradicating the black infestation from her mindscape. She felt instantly cleaner and more clear-headed. Rigel did her best to send feelings of gratitude toward the construct, knowing that if it weren't for him, she'd be collapsed in a heap on the floor. She got the echo of smugness in return, and the faint sound of his voice saying, "Typical Zoil." That confirmed, Rigel was left to ask why Riddle would give the staff up now, and what he hoped to gain by awarding it to the tournament's winner. It could simply be that he had no more use for the tool, but she doubted it. At close range, its power was incredibly fast-acting and potent. It made her appreciate exactly how diluted a form of the sickness she'd dealt with in her first year. She wondered how susceptible she would be to its influence if she was in its presence for a prolonged period of time. "Rigel, what are you doing?" She whirled around to see Theo holding the hand of Zacharias Smith, clearly startled to find her in the place he'd intended to sneak away with his date to. "I just needed a moment," she said. Summoning a smile, she smoothed her dress robes restlessly and calmly made her way back to the party proper. It was only after she began to wander through the crush that she realized she had no idea where Archie had gone. -0. DM. -0. Rigel's cousin had changed. There was the obvious, made more so by her aggressively feminine attire, but something about the girl's very nature seemed to have altered since the last time Draco had seen her. Potter seemed to bubble. She wandered the hall with a wide, cheerful smile on her face, greeting those who met her eyes good-naturedly and without reservation. He supposed with a critical frown that she may have simply gained some sort of social confidence with her physical maturity. Certainly no one would mistake her for her cousin now. He personally hadn't found the half-blood lacking in confidence before, but what did he know about teenage girls? Pansy alone was enough mystery for one person to spend a lifetime unraveling. The Potter heiress paused in her journey across the hall as the Weasley twin menaces called her name, and shortly the girl was engaged in animated conversation with the two of them plus a rather bemused-looking Sousa. From his vantage point near the windows, he could see the girl's green eyes as she flicked them restlessly about the room. Eventually her gaze settled, and he followed its trajectory to the dance floor. She was watching the Bulgarian champion and his date, the Granger girl Rigel kept bringing to their table during meals. No, he realized after a curious moment of analysis. She was only watching one of them. Potter's eyes followed Granger's smile with a wistful longing so heartbroken that it could only mean one thing. Potter wanted Granger. Draco was bewildered as the implications settled over him. Why hadn't the girl asked Granger to the ball herself, then? Had she not had the chance before Crumb got there first? Draco snorted. Perhaps the mudblood was smarter than he'd thought, if she'd chosen the pure-blooded Bulgarian over a half-blooded blue-stocking like Potter. The longer he watched her watch Granger, however, the more his emotions turned from amusement to irritation. Whatever her feelings, Potter had accompanied Rigel to the ball, not Granger. She ought to be at least attempting to pay attention to her date. Where was Rigel, anyway? Draco craned his neck, aided by the extra height he'd gained since the beginning of the term, and eventually spotted Rigel near the refreshment table on the other side of the hall. Thirsty? He asked Pansy. His patient date slid him a sideways look that said he was not fooling anyone and said, "Yes, now that you mention it. Shall we move toward the punch?" He took her arm with perfect gentility and led the delicate blonde confidently through the crush. A glance at her face revealed a very small smile of amusement, tucked into an otherwise blandly polite expression. Draco felt a pang as he admitted the lovely girl could have had her pick of suitors and had probably only accompanied him to save him the trouble of escorting someone he had no interest in giving his full attention. Pansy was too good for him, but then, that wasn't really news. He didn't make further pretense of perusing the refreshments when they had crossed the hall, rather, he towed Pansy toward Rigel and caught their friend with a light hand on his arm. Rigel turned and eyed them both with a relieved smile. "How's it going? Have you seen Harry?" "She's busy mooning after Granger," he said before he could check the words. "Millimeter, not surprising," Rigel said distractedly. "Where, though?" Draco made an impatient noise in his throat and said, struggling to keep his voice even, "Don't you even care?" "She wants someone else, Rigel." "I know." Rigel looked over at him with eyebrows raised in surprise. "It's not a love match, remember." Draco didn't understand it. How could he value himself so lightly? Would he really rather be with someone who doesn't love him than entertain even the possibility of being with Draco? He tried to steel his mind against such thoughts. He was supposed to be moving past that, or at least trying to for Rigel's sake. It was hard to watch him act as though he didn't deserve anything more than his disinterested cousin, but Draco reminded himself that Rigel's priorities were not his own. He guessed it was probably easier for Rigel to be in a relationship he didn't have to contribute to. Still, he thought Harriet Potter an unforgivable idiot who didn't deserve Rigel in the least. "She was over by that tree with the silver birds on the branches," Pansy said softly. "Thanks, Pan." Rigel shot them a parting smile and melted into the crowd again. Draco forced himself to turn and begin ladling punch from a bowl rather than stare after his friend like some sort of lovelorn idiot. Pansy took the glass with a sympathetic smile and patted his arm gently. "It's his life," she said. "We can't make him live it differently." Draco looked at her, really looked, for the first time that night. He noticed the silver dusting of diamond powder in her hair, the painstakingly perfect curls that must have been created one at a time, and the slightly bored glaze to her soft blue eyes. I've been a poor date, he said, apology in his tone. She lifted a corner of her mouth. I anticipated as much, she admitted. Then she added, I considered a match with him too, you know. Draco's eyes widened in surprise, but Pansy only shrugged self-deprecatingly. It was early on, before I realized the truth. What truth? Rigel's already decided to live without love. Pansy's eyes were sad, but firm in their belief. I don't know when he made that choice, but I suspect it was before he ever met us. It isn't personal, and it isn't something anyone can make him you and decide. Until he allows affection willingly into his life, it will always be something intrusive to him. Something troubling, rather than something wonderful. Draco's mind fought against such a proclamation. But he cares so deeply, he said, voice slightly hoarse. It isn't that he's incapable, Pansy agreed. One day, Rigel may love someone quite fiercely. For now, however, he simply won't accept it from anyone. Her words didn't make him feel better, exactly, but a pinch in his pride that he hadn't realized was there did ease just a bit. She's right, he realized with an internal groan, and I really am a willful fool. All the evidence had been before him, from Rigel's constant discomfort with attention and affection to his oblivious dismissal of those such as Jew and Matthews. Even his lack of concern with his cousin's obvious desire for someone else was proof of Pansy's point. Rigel neither sought love nor recognized it when it came for him. Perhaps it was best, then, that the dark-haired boy hadn't attempted to entertain Draco's suit out of some sense of kindness or duty of friendship. Perhaps, as Rigel had said, it would only have ended poorly. -0. HP. -0. By the time she got to the tree Pansy had indicated, it seemed Archie had moved on. She pressed herself up onto the toes of her two shiny shoes and tried to see over the heads of those around her. Most of those present were adults, however, and she resigned herself to searching the sea of bodies one section at a time. She saw her father standing at the minister's shoulder and carefully avoided that circle. He didn't look pleased to be on guard duty again, but she supposed he couldn't ask Dawlish to do it as long as he was technically assigned to Hogwarts. Thankfully, Archie didn't seem to be anywhere near there. The last thing she needed was to see James publicly lose his mind over Archie's choice of attire. Archie. At the sound of her cousin's name, she whipped her head around to look for him, then realized that, obviously, it was meant for her. After a moment of confusion, she saw Sirius dart from behind two witches in voluptuous skirts and come to a panting stop before her. There you are, he said brightly. Mad crowd, eh? He scooped Rigel up into a hug fierce enough to take her breath away. Congratulations, Arch. I'm glad you'll be coming home to us safe. She hugged him back firmly. I always will, Dad. And thanks, but I'm pretty sure the judging is rigged. He barked out a laugh and drew back to look down at her. I liked your speech. Thought Riddle was going to swallow his forked tongue. She let out an undignified snort, picturing the statesman with said appendage flicking out from behind his teeth whenever he talked. It was spur of the moment, she admitted. I couldn't resist an opportunity to rain on Riddle's blood-fueled parade. Undermining from within, I get it, Sirius said, nodding slowly. He leaned closer and added, don't tell your aunt I said this, but, sometimes having a seat at the table is more productive than protesting the table's existence. His face screwed up as he attempted to caveat his metaphor. That is not to say the table is the only outlet for expression. Just, you know, throwing away the opportunity to sit there won't help those who never get a chance to, right? She frowned. Sure, she said, though she wasn't certain she knew what exactly he was trying to say. Maybe he would have explained further, but Regulus Black swooped down on them in that moment, clearing his throat as he approached. She wondered whether he had embedded a tracking charm into Sirius's skin at some point. The man never had trouble finding his older brother, no matter how large the gathering. Sirius, he said, nodding with the barest suggestion of respect. Nephew. His grey eyes on her were warm with approval. Excellent showing in the third task. The might of the House of Black will be unquestioned for years to come. She stared up at him in utter surprise. Regulus had never been so openly complimentary. Thank you, Uncle, she said slowly. I'm gratified you didn't find the display overly vulgar. The slender man narrowed his eyes at her. If the tournament were subject to the common British dueling etiquette, you'd have been disqualified a number of times over. Then again, you'd never have faced an opponent with a blade in those circumstances, either. Anyone could forgive a certain amount of indecorous creative action, as it were. Any Slytherin, you mean? Sirius said, rolling his eyes. Just admit Archie was awesome, Reggie. Do not call me that, Regulus hissed. Watching his eyes flare over the childish nickname, Rigel tried to hide a smile. They never looked more like brothers than when they bickered. Regulus seemed to catch her amusement in any case, and he let the faintest of scowls cross his face. Don't think you'll be excused for every lapse in tradition you displayed on that stage, he said sharply. Wherever did you learn such swift application of runes? That's not in any compendium of standard dueling techniques that I've seen. She smiled innocently at him. It was more